What is the most memorable moment you shared with a stranger who you never saw again? I was about 10 years old and I had a pair of Heelys and they were the coolest effing thing on the earth. I would roll all over on those things and thought I was hot crap. We were in China, spending a few weeks in Beijing. I was rolling around in Tiananmen Square, hit a crack and lost one of the wheels. I looked around for about an hour, but to no avail. I was probably visibly bummed, as my Heelys, the things that made me hot crap, were now ineffective and basically ruined. The next morning, I was walking through the square on the way to meet my friends, and an older gentleman ran up to me and stopped me. He had found my wheel. He said he had seen me rolling around and saw me looking for the wheel after I fell. He saw that I gave up and stuck around for another hour to keep looking after I left. He came there the next morning with no expectation that I'd pass through, but wanted to be there just in case. I'm not sure who was happier, me that I got my wheel back, or him because he didn't think he'd see me in literally the world's busiest square. I said thank you and that was about it. We both had places to be and that was that. Story 2. When I lost my iPhone 3G, the second-gen iPhone that was the first to have 3G, and among the first massively produced smartphones, I stupidly camped out for that stupid phone like an idiot. That next day, I went overseas on a government work trip to Taiwan. I lost my phone on my first night there. I retraced my steps, but nothing. I resigned to the fact that I lost my brand new iPhone 3G. The next day, I was walking to the shipyard in the busy city of Keelung, port city of Taipei, and this guy runs out of a restaurant and flags me down. He motions for me to go to his cab. I said, it's okay, I don't need a cab. He shakes his head, runs inside his cab, and gives me my phone back, along with a work pin that fell out of my pocket into his cab. I was absolutely shocked. I thanked him so much, and he just smiled this biggest smile. I couldn't speak Mandarin nor Taiwanese, nor could he speak English, but body language is universal. He motioned for me to join him for breakfast back at the restaurant he ran out of where he saw me stroll by. He ordered me some super delicious Taiwanese-style noodles, and I ate them. He paid for the meal. I tried to compensate him for all his troubles. He refused. This old man worked double duty at that restaurant and as a taxi driver, and you can see on his hands and face all the hard manual labor he did through the decades of his life. Oh yeah, his wife worked at that restaurant too. I demanded that I know his phone number. For years after, my colleagues and I used him exclusively for our taxi rides around town. I'd post his number on our ship's quarterdeck and label it taxi. Also, me and my colleagues would make the trip to eat at the restaurant where they worked as much as we could. The restaurant closed down about 5 years ago, though. I even called him to take me to and from the airport, which is comparatively a large fare over there. I didn't mind. He deserved it. I couldn't find him anymore when I went back a few years ago for vacation, about 2016. I'm hoping upon hope he finally retired to the countryside in a small home on the hillside and living out his days in quiet with his wife. Story 3. I was on a long, late-night bus ride. It was express, so it made very few stops. The bus had maybe 10 people on it total. Halfway through the trip, it made a stop at a small town station so people could grab a snack or use a public restroom and maybe stretch their legs. I went up to the counter to buy what at that point was my dinner, even though it was after 10 p.m., and when the cashier rang it up, I passed a $50 bill to her and she told me that she couldn't make change. Defeated, I went back to my seat on the bus. As everyone piled on and the bus drove away, a lovely middle-aged lady walked up from her seat near the back and politely asked if I minded if she sat with me. I told her she was more than welcome. She sits and proceeds to unpack a small lunch bag. She then split the entirety of her meal with me. She said she had been waiting for the washroom to clear out and had overheard what happened. She said, "I've gone hungry in my life and it sucks. I wouldn't wish it on anyone, so you can share with me." When we were done, I jokingly asked if she could break a 50 and we had a good laugh. She stuck with me for the remainder of the trip and was a very interesting lady, besides being incredibly generous. I hope she's well. Story 4. I was on an eastbound train from Colorado 2 days before Christmas. There was some kind of incident in another car around 11 o'clock that night. A dude got wasted and started threatening other passengers, and we had to make a stop so that the local police could come and collect him. After the delay, the conductor came over the speakers and announced that if anyone was feeling upset or shaken by the incident, one of the passengers had offered to play his guitar in the snack car, and anyone who was awake was welcome to come down and join in for a sing-along. I'm always down for weird train activities, so I decided to grab my harmonica from my bag and head down. There were about 15 of us in the car, ranging in age from 16 to mid-70s, and from all over the country. We sang every song we could think of that even kind of referenced a train. We were somewhere in rural Nebraska at that point, and nobody had cell service to look up lyrics, so at times I was pretty sure that we were making up more of the words than we actually remembered. The conductor came through after a while and offered to play a few songs, so the guy with the guitar handed it off and pulled out a mandolin, and my harmonica got passed around the group while one guy drummed along on his backpack. After a while, the conductor got up and left, then came back with a copy of Polar Express. He read it out loud to our absolutely captivated group of mostly adult travelers while the snow flew all around us in the night. And I swear that for a few minutes, our trip felt every bit as magical as the visit to Santa Claus in the story. Sometime well after the snack car was supposed to have been vacated for the night, we capped things off with the most ridiculously earnest rendition of Don't Stop Believin' that has ever been performed and went our separate ways. I never saw anyone from our little makeshift band again, but I'll always remember that weird, wonderful late-night celebration of Journey and the magic of winter travel that came about because some guy was a jackass on a train. Story 5. I've told this story before, but people like it, so I'll share it again. When I was a kid, we didn't have a lot of money, so we often shopped at thrift stores. What I loved about that was that you could get 10 books for $1, so I would plant myself in front of the book selection and make piles of which one I wanted to get, and then decided after I'd gone through them all. One day, an older lady saw me sitting with my piles and asked if I liked to read. I told her I did, and I showed her a few of the books I found that I liked. She smiled and then pulled $1 out of her purse, handed it to me and said, "Promise me that you'll keep reading." I was so happy and immediately stood up and said that I would. She smiled and walked away, and I went back to my piles, able to pick out an extra 10 books to take home. It was just a small act of kindness for her, but for me, having a random stranger encourage my love of reading and making me promise to never stop definitely had a lot to do with my continued love of reading. This was over 20 years or so ago, but I still think of her whenever I buy a new book. Story 6. When I was studying abroad in Lithuania, I volunteered at a soup kitchen, and every now and again, there would be an older lady helping out who dropped off supplies. We would smile at each other and say hello, even through the language barrier. Well, one night I went to Easter Mass in the town I was volunteering in, and it was warmer during the day, so I didn't think about bringing a heavier jacket once it got dark. Not to mention, the church was this old, massive building. So I'm sitting through Mass, and I'm getting colder, and start shivering pretty noticeably, when all of a sudden I feel someone drape a scarf over my shoulders. I turn around, and it's the lady who would drop off supplies at the soup kitchen. Once Mass was over, I tried to return the scarf, but she refused to take it back. I did my best to extend my gratitude through the language barrier, but I'm sure she knew. It was the most beautiful and kindest thing that's ever happened to me. That was the last time I saw her, and I'll never forget her kindness towards me. It still tears me up thinking about it. Story 7. I'll share the Cliff Notes version since it sounds so unreal. Years ago, I walked to a bridge with the intention of unaliving myself by jumping off. Met a guy there who wouldn't stop hovering around me. Eventually, he approaches me and tells me that, quote, "I have bad spirits around me, and that I should keep my head up and not give in to them." He then asks me if he can smudge me. I didn't know what that was, but agreed anyway. He pulls out sage, a lighter, and a shell from his backpack and proceeds to bless me right there. As soon as he finishes, a bunch of birds, seagulls, crows, and pigeons, all come flying over and fly in circles above us. He said that they were telling me my life was about to turn around, and then he said goodbye and left. My life did change that day, big time, and when my mind occasionally creeps back to dark places, I think of him and it pulls me back. So this is a great kind of guardian angel sort of story. I just wanted to highlight the importance of just having someone, even if it's a total stranger. That one conversation can not only save a life, but it can change a life. So that's a great story to share. Story 9. I met a young woman who was crying her eyes out in the back of the train station CVS while I was there picking up stamps before heading out onto the train to catch my flight home. I had to get some bills in the post before I left, or I'd forget about them. She had a very young, about 2-year-old child with her, and the kid was getting progressively more panicky that his mom was losing it in public. She was underdressed for the snowstorm outside, though the kid was bundled up properly in oversized clothes that looked like they might have been hers. They both only spoke Spanish, but I was able to go up and ask what was going on. The young mom wailed, but the little boy was very interested in my big rolly suitcase. I offered, in Spanish, to watch him for a few minutes while she got things sorted out and cleaned herself up in the bathroom, then took him on a walk through the food aisles and let him pick out some snacks, which I bought for him. About 15 minutes later, she came out of the bathroom looking like a different person. She cried again when I offered her the bag of groceries and a 20, which was all the cash I had on me, and tried not to accept it until I insisted. She thanked me profusely, the little kid hugged me, and they left into the Boston winter. I can't imagine how bad things must have been to trust a stranger with her kid, but it was one of those moments where I realized I had the opportunity to make an actual difference in the way this kid lived for at least the next week or so. He was well-mannered, and as someone who's volunteered in at-risk grade school classrooms, didn't give off the impression that trusted adults had ever harmed him. He was just hungry and scared about whatever was going on with his mom. I have no idea where they are, and I hope they're both okay. Story 10. This was last year. It was my 21st birthday, and I went to Moe's for my free birthday burrito. As I was walking out, I slipped on one of the mats. They had just mopped and put the mats back down before the floor dried, and I busted my ass. I was so embarrassed and in so much pain, but a few people helped me up. One middle-aged woman helped me into the booth she was sitting in and took charge of the situation. She had them remake my food and bring it to the table, as well as a first aid kit and a manager. She bandaged up my hand and knee and elbow, all while getting the manager's information in case I needed them to pay for doctor's bills, and got me like $100 in Moe's coupons. When my food finally came out, she made me sit with her and eat. We ended up talking for like an hour. She told me about her family, and she said if it was her daughter in my situation, she'd want someone to step in and take care of her. When we were finished, she helped me hobble to my car and gave me a huge hug and told me happy birthday. I was so beyond thankful for her and her small act of kindness towards me. Story 11. In 2014, it snowed 2 inches in central North Carolina during business hours. To this day, we call the commute home snowpocalypse. North Carolina and its drivers are just unprepared to deal with this sort of thing. My normal 10-minute commute turned into a 2-hour ordeal of gridlock across surface streets. I waited patiently for the lights to turn at the corner of Markham and Broad. I was second in line to go. Behind me, the cars stretched as far as the eye could see, but finally, I was just blocks away from home. Almost there. The light turned green, and the car in front of me started to move, but began fishtailing in the newly fallen snow. The guy behind me got out of his car, knocked on my window. "Is she stuck?" he said. I nodded. In an unspoken moment of agreement, I got out too, and together we walked over to the stuck vehicle, still fishtailing, and began pushing from behind. We too slipped and slid in the snow, but the extra traction was enough that the car was able to make a right turn. I and my newly found friend walked back to our cars, and just as fast as I started to move forward, red light. The intersection gridlocked again, and it took me another half hour to drive the several blocks home. There was some sense of camaraderie in the common experience of being stuck in traffic due to a light snowfall, but that's North Carolina for you. Story 12. Well, I actually did see this person again, but I think you'll like it. When I was 11, in 2002, I was diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia, a very rare form that's hard to treat. Went through the treatments and bone marrow transplant really well though, and got better, etc. When I was 14, I was picked to go to a ranch in Colorado for kids that had health issues like myself. Anyways, on one of the connecting flights, I sat next to an older woman and she noticed a car magazine that I had. We started talking and I told her I liked Mustangs, and turns out she had 2 82 GTs. Had won awards with them, etc. It was really cool to talk to her, and when we landed, we went our separate ways. Fast forward 2 to 3 years, can't remember exactly, and my dad and I drove to Arkansas to pick up a mint 82 GT. We get there and start talking to her, and she starts saying the other car she has, and it finally clicked in my head. She was the lady on the plane. When I mentioned that to her, she remembered me, and it was just pretty amazing that in a population of over 300 million, we found each other again. Just my mildly interesting story. Story 13. Don't know if it counts if I saw him the next day, but I haven't seen him since. I was bartending in a place with outside tables, taking a half break smoking a cig with some regulars when they pointed out this wastoid. He's stumbling, hacking, dry heaving, and spitting down the block. He leans on a couple of poles for a couple different moments. He gets to his truck, which is parked out right in front of us, and is struggling to get into it. I go over and talk him out of driving, and he explains he's not drunk, in the same fashion that all drunks do. As a responsible bartender, I urge him again not to drive, and he says, "Something's not right, man. I really don't feel well." So I say, "I believe you, but maybe you should go to the hospital." He tells me he is, but he can't afford the ambulance. I convince him he can't afford a car accident then either, and it will only take a moment for me to hail him a cab. Oh, this is before Uber. He concedes, and in under a minute, I grab him a cab and tell the cabbie to take him to Mercy Hospital, the closest in the area. At this point, he's doing much worse, so I hand the cabbie $20 and tell him to rush. The next day, the guy comes back for his car and to thank me. He was having some sort of respiratory attack and would have surely died without medical treatment. He tried to pay me the 20 back, and at that point, his tears have me really choking up, and I refused his money, telling him, quote, to pay it to the hospital, $5 at a time. That'll keep the hospital off your back for at least 4 months. After a million thank yous and I owe you my life, he drives away, never to be seen again. Story 14. When I first moved to a small town in Florida, I quickly realized how sparse jobs were. I was desperate and turned to Craigslist. I found a secretary position that seemed too good to be true. The owner of the company quickly replied and said we'd do an interview in a public restaurant. Usually I'm not so naive, but off I went. It was terribly uncomfortable. He wasn't just looking for a secretary, he wanted to pay me to be his mistress or partner, whatever you want to call it. He said I must stay in his condo with him, and if I didn't like it, I could pick out another place for us to live. Then begun to ask more derogatory questions. I told him that this would not work out for me, that I moved to help take care of my ill father, and that I was looking strictly for a normal job. I excused myself to the restroom, where an older gentleman stopped me and told me he had heard everything said. He told me I needed to get out of there and that there was something seriously off with this man. So after I use the restroom, I go back to the table to firmly decline the offer and thank him for the opportunity when he got seriously angry, saying we could be such a great team, that I'm missing out on a wonderful life with him, all while he's getting louder and more in my face. When the sweet gentleman came over pretending to be my grandfather and asked why I didn't let him know I was in the area that evening. He said he noticed we were through with dinner and asked if I would sit with him for a bit to catch up, and I gratefully took his offer. He told me a little about his retirement, wife, children, and grandchildren, also pointed out the man that interviewed me was standing outside watching through the window. When we realized he wasn't going to leave, he walked me out to my car and watched me safely go. I'm forever thankful for him because honestly, who knows what could have happened. I'm also a lot better with my decision making when it comes to meeting strangers, whether it's in public or not. Story 15. It'll get buried, but I still can't stop thinking about this. Valentine's Day 2014. I was a hella depressed college student studying abroad in wintry New York. I had recently had back surgery and was struggling to walk as it was, and the slippery, icy streets didn't help. I was walking along the street I lived on, and I happened to be walking in the same direction, but 10 feet behind a woman about my height. She was wearing leggings and a black coat. She was obviously dressed to impress and was probably going out on a date. I just felt bad because she seemed cold. Before I knew it, we'd been walking along this dimly lit street. Me 10 feet behind her for about 3 blocks. I started to get the impression from her body language that she was trying to shake me off and thought I was a creep or something. I was dressed in a black winter jacket, dark pants, and had a black beanie on and realized I probably was wearing my SAE look. Eventually, we reached a streetlight and I caught up with her. There were no cars around, so I don't know why she stopped. Then I saw this massive pool of ice surrounding the curb we were standing on, and she, wearing heels, probably felt trapped. I instinctively said, well, that looks hella dangerous. I'd go around it if I were you. And I pointed at a way she could go. She nervously said, yeah, thanks. I went first and didn't slip, but could tell it was slippery, so I said, mind if I help you? And stuck out my hand as she was going to take her first step onto the black ice. She said, no, I'm fine, and slipped, grabbed my proffered arm, and we both kind of ice skated around in a half circle, so we switched positions, and I made sure she was standing upright, and I ended up falling on my ass instead of her because I thought she'd hit the curb. I slowly regained my balance and got up after failing to do so twice, and she was apologizing and thanking me profusely, and I just said, no worries. She offered to buy me a cup of coffee because I was being so nice, but I didn't want to come across as a creep and kinda just got shy, I guess, so said, that's okay, you look really nice, I hope you enjoy your date, stay safe, and said bye and headed off to a different street. I assumed she wasn't single because she was so beautiful. I still think about what if I'd said yes to that coffee, because a few weeks later, my roommate tried offing himself. A month after that, I tried the same, was put on lithium and crap, then packed up to be sent home. And 3 years and several semesters off later, I dropped out of college. I'm still rebuilding. It's going slow, but it's going. But it's little moments like that which make me think they were forks in the road to where I am now. You know, the axiomatic events in your life that divide it between going one way and another. This'll get buried, but what's a shot in the dark when you have nothing to lose? If you slipped around 7 to 8 p.m. on the 400 block of Broome Street on Valentine's Day 2014 and still want to get that coffee though, hit me up, lol. I kind of like the juxtaposition of this post, but if only there was a hard, fast rule that every single beautiful woman in the world was not single. They're not single just because they're pretty. That line was kind of funny. So yeah, good story. Story 16. I walked into a laundromat and a stranger said, "Hi." I smiled and said, "Hello," put my laundry in the washers and sat to read. The stranger, Victor, turned to me and said, "So how is 2014 going to be different for you?" Unsure about spilling my guts to this stranger, I laughed and said, "I have no idea. What about you? I'm going to, not procrastinate. When I say I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do more. I really want to help people this year. I love that. I don't do it enough. People are so caught up in their own lives. They never even say, 'Hi, how are you?' to strangers anymore, just to be nice. And when you do, people just give you this look. Why can't we just be friendly?" I saw this guy moving into one of the trailers, and his 9-year-old daughter was struggling to help him move a washer into the house. I was on my way to the store, but I stopped and said, "Hey, can I help you? How about you go inside and I'll stay out here and help you get it in the door?" See, I didn't want him to think I was trying to rob him or anything. He just looked like he was struggling, and all these people just kept walking by. They just walked right past him. Why? We came into this world with nothing, and that's how we leave. What difference do we make? We're just dust in the wind, aren't we? What I'm saying is we have to live our lives. Life is short, and it's all about love. Love, 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 love. Just love people. Be slow to speak and quick to listen. People will tell you what's in their heart, even if it's not what they're saying. You just have to listen. Victor and I sat and talked for nearly 2 hours. My laundry took 40 minutes. It's funny how the most unexpected people can say exactly what you need to hear and listen when you just need to speak. Let's try to be more like Victor. Do more. Help others. Say hi. Live your life. Love, 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 and listen. Story 17. On a flight out for a long weekend, I decided to sit next to the 2 unaccompanied minors on the plane. As soon as I sat down, the flight attendant was like, "Are you sure? We usually don't get volunteers for sitting with the kids." I decided I was sure, and settled in for the 3-hour flight. The weather decided to strand us on the runway for an extra 2 hours, however. Normally, this would have been terrible and boring and stressful, and everyone in the plane would be in a bad mood. With these kids, I had a high old time. They were 2 boys, 9 and 11, not related, but both going home to one parent after a summer with the other. I started asking them questions, trying to make conversation, and they opened up and started asking questions right back. Most of their questions were typical of elementary schoolers. How does X work? Why is Y that way? And I did my best to answer them. At one point, I accidentally introduced, and therefore had to explain, the concept of Schrodinger's cat, which led to explaining quantum physics, in the most basic limited sense. And then, somehow, multiverse theory? We also talked about air pressure and gas density and how molecules worked, and so much more. One boy showed me his summer memory scrapbook, and the other found out I coded and had so many questions for me. He was appropriately wearing a Future Hacker t-shirt. The flight attendants gave us these punch-out planes to build, and we soared them around our seats and made up some stories. All in all, highly entertaining. The best part, however, came at the end of the flight. The boy with the scrapbook had his mom take a picture of the 3 of us so he could add it in. But then, even better, were all the adults who came up to me and said thank you, which confused me at first. They wanted to express their pleasure at seeing me, a youngish student, interacting in a genuine way with the next generation. Everyone sitting around us was happy and in an altogether better mood for watching curiosity be encouraged. It remains my ultimate goal whenever I interact with children. Story 18. This story is not my story. It's from a thread years ago and always comes to my mind when I think about strangers sharing a memorable moment. I was day tripping to Vancouver from Seattle and stopped in for lunch at a little cafe. From my window, I saw a young teenage girl out in the cold, squatted down in a closed-up business doorway, holding a small bundle in her arms. She was panhandling. People were mostly walking by, ignoring her. She looked just broken. I finished up my meal and went outside, went through my wallet and thought I'd give her $5 for some food. I got up to her and she was sobbing. She looked like she was 14 or 15. And that bundle in her arms was a baby wrapped up. I felt like I just got punched in the chest. She looked up, putting on her game face, and asked for any change. I asked her if she'd like some lunch. Right next door was a small Quick Trip type grocery store. I got a can of formula for the baby, very young, maybe 2 to 3 months old, and took her back to the cafe, though I'd just eaten. She was very thankful, got a burger and just inhaled it. Got her some pie and ice cream. She opened up and we talked. She was 15, got pregnant. Parents were angry and she was fighting with them. She ran away. She's been gone almost 1 full year. I asked her if she'd like to go home and she got silent. I coaxed her, said her parents wouldn't want her back. I coaxed her further. She admitted she stole $5,000 in cash from her dad. Turns out $5,000 doesn't last long at all, and the streets are tough on a 15-year-old. Very tough. She did want to go back, but she was afraid no one wanted her back after what she did. We talked more. I wanted her to use my phone to call home, but she wouldn't. I told her I'd call and see if her folks wanted to talk to her. She hesitated and gave bad excuses, but eventually agreed. She dialed the number and I took the phone. Her mom picked up and I said hello. Awkwardly introduced myself and said her daughter would like to speak to her. Silence, and I heard crying. Gave the phone to the girl, and she was just quiet listening to her mom cry. Then said hello, and she cried. They talked. She gave the phone back to me. I talked to her mom some more. I drove her down to the bus station and bought her a bus ticket home. Gave her $100 cash for incidentals and some formula, diapers, wipes, and snacks for the road. Got to the bus, and she just cried, saying thank you over and over. I gave her a kiss on the forehead and a hug. Kissed her baby, and she got on the bus. I get a Christmas card every year from her. She's 21 now and in college. Her name is Michaela, and her baby was Joe. I've never really told anyone about this. I just feel good knowing I did something good in this world. Maybe it'll make up for the things I've effed up. Fantastic story. You could make a movie about it. Thank you for being such a good person, OP. You really did change and save a life. So that's an awesome, awesome tale. Story 19. In May of 2017, I decided to travel to Norway to do something I've always wanted to do. I had a layover in Iceland, which then flew to Bergen. During my layover in Iceland, I had about 2 hours to kill. I sat by myself and read my book, occasionally popping up to people watch. I noticed one well-dressed gentleman sitting about 20 feet away browsing on his phone. I'm unsure how to explain it, but I remember thinking, he seems like a really interesting guy to talk to. I was far too shy to approach a stranger, though. As we boarded the flight, I took my seat. Then, the same gentleman I noticed earlier happened to sit right next to me. We struck conversation quickly, as it was my first time ever traveling out of country. Turns out, he was from Norway, and worked as a tour guide for elderly Norwegian seniors who wanted to see the world. He traveled to many countries, and we had a conversation based around that. He gave me great suggestions and tips for how to handle myself and what to do in Norway. I really enjoyed the conversation. As we were landing, I told him my planned itinerary for the month. He suggested I make time to visit Trondheim, which was his hometown that he was going back to. I kept it in the back of my mind the whole first week. After my first week in Stavanger, I headed off to Oslo. After the first couple days, and exhausting the majority of all the touristy events, I decided to change my plans. Off his recommendation, I decided to head off to Trondheim. I took a 10-hour train ride from Oslo and made it there. I'd never been so happy in retrospect about an impulsive decision. Trondheim ended up being my favorite part of the whole trip, and I credit it all to the stranger from the flight. His name was Frode. I hope one day to run into him again and tell him about my experience. It was a 35-day trip of a lifetime I'll never forget. I wish I was able to give him my thanks for his suggestions, kindness, and generosity. Story 20. The summer after I graduated high school, I walked the Camino de Santiago across northern Spain. You meet tons of people walking the Camino, and one day, near the end of the trail, I met a boy my age named Julius. He was from Germany and had taken a gap year to live in Spain and had been walking the Camino for a couple months already. It turns out we were staying in the same hostel that night, an ancient monastery that was run by some monks. Julius and I got to talking and ventured into the enormous stone cathedral on the monastery grounds. There was moss growing on the stone walls and pigeons flying around, and he and I stayed and talked there for about 2 hours. We talked about everything under the sun, from why we were walking the Camino to philosophy to our futures. It was getting late and we had to get to bed to wake up early to keep on walking, but we were both stopping in the same town the next night, so we thought we'd surely see each other. Unfortunately, it was in that small town that various different paths converged, so there were about 10 different hostels, and I couldn't find Julius in any one of them. I still think about him from time to time and wonder what great friends we could have been if we'd run into each other again or even shared our last names. So it goes. Story 21. I was in Zurich, Switzerland for a weekend while on business in the area. Saturday around noonish, I was walking around the lake when I saw a young woman sitting under one of the trees crying. I cautiously approached and asked if she was okay, but she just looked up for a second and kept crying. Not quite sure why, but I sat down next to her. Some part of me would just feel bad leaving her there crying. She didn't want to talk about what was making her upset, understandable, so I tried to take her mind off it with other conversation. She was a grad student, originally from Germany. I suggested we go cop opera tickets since there's a steep discount for students. She was down, so we walked to the box office and got 2 tickets for the show that evening. Had a nice talk over coffee for a few hours until the show started. The show ended up being all in German. She helped translate the important parts for me. First time at an opera, and with a complete stranger. When the show was over, she said goodnight and goodbye and parted ways. No contact info exchanged or any pictures. I don't quite remember her face or name at this point, but it was a good, wholesome day with a total stranger. Story 22. I was on a flight from San Francisco to LA to visit my best friend. It was a beautiful day outside, and the flight itself only takes about an hour and some change. I was sitting next to this very old woman. Her and I didn't really chat, just said hello and then went about reading or dozing off. About 20 or so minutes before we should be making our way to landing, we begin to feel some turbulence. I'm no stranger to flying. I've flown every year back and forth and back again since I was 4 years old. Long story, but essentially divorced parents on either end of the states. So this isn't unusual to me, and the lady next to me didn't seem to mind either. Well, then a huge turbulence hit, and the plane, it felt like the plane went sideways very fast. It was horrifying, and I'm crying at this point. Not sobbing, more like tears are just forming and falling from my eyes. And the lady and I both at the same time grab each other's hands. Despite all the passengers screaming, including me, the flight crew and the captain tell us nothing. We literally don't know if we're going to die or what has happened. This is the most turbulence I've ever felt in my life. That lady and I held hands until we landed and left the plane. I still think about her frequently, and I hope I gave her as much courage and strength through held hands that she definitely gave to me. Edited to add, I have no idea what happened. We were never told. Just bad turbulence, I guess. Story 23. I was headed out with my kids to do some errands, and in the foyer, there is an older lady who looked extremely upset and worried. I don't know what it was, but I went up and asked if she was okay. She didn't speak English very well, but good enough that we could understand each other. She was terrified and wondering where she could find a safe space in case something like the France attacks were to happen here. This was just a few days after the attacks happened in France, and it had this poor lady freaked out. So I offered to drive her around and get some info for her and put off my stuff until later. We drove to the YMCA, and the person at the desk gave me a look like I was insane when I asked what I could do for this lady, and she said, call 311. So I was like, okay, well, I can drive you back to our condo complex, but I do have to go shopping. Would you like to come? So she said yes, and she came with us. I quickly ran and grabbed the things I needed, and she was sitting on some benches waiting for me and talking with my kids, who just adored her from the start. I drove her back to our place and said I can get some phone numbers off the net for you if you'd like to call them. So I found some numbers and gave them to her and said they might have better news for you. I kept trying to tell her the whole time that she shouldn't be worrying about someone getting to the complex and shooting it up, but something about those attacks freaked her right out. Usually her daughter is with her, but she happened to be out of town. So anyways, she thanked me and went down to her floor of the building. About 10 minutes later, I hear a knock on my door, and it's the lady back. She said she was having a hard time asking the right questions, so I said, come on in, I'll make the calls. So I called around, explained the situation to the other person on the line, and she was understanding and pretty much told me what I had been saying to this lady, that if there ever was something going on in our city, the TVs and radios would be telling us to stay inside and so on. The lady seemed to finally be calming down after about an hour of me trying to explain things. I asked if she was okay, and she thanked me and said she would be fine. Something in my mind told me I wasn't done with this yet. So I gave her my phone number. My husband got home and I told him about my day helping this lady out, and it was just so beyond anything. It was strange, but my brain was just yelling at me to help this lady out. 2 days later, I get a call from the lady about something I can't quite remember, but it was something she needed help with in her apartment. So my husband and I went to help because I didn't want to send my hubby alone in case she felt uncomfortable. He helped her and we went back to our place. I never happened to run into her again in the rest of the months living in that condo. I assumed her daughter got back and was taking care of her. Never in my life I ever thought I would do that for someone. I know that I would ask, "Are you okay? Do you need anything?" but not really. Go out of my way, but I did this one time. I'm glad I did. Story 24. I was 17 and hiking through a canyon in Big Bend National Park the day after Y2K. There's a spot where you had to get into the water and climb out of a pool of water to continue on. A friend and I ditched our shirts, shoes, and a disposable camera behind a rock and went ahead. On the way back, we run into what I thought was the most beautiful British girl ever, though she looked Italian, and two of her friends. They asked us if it was worth it to get wet and keep on going past the pool, and we said yes. The guys went right on ahead, but the girl was hesitant. She asked if we would help her. Then she gets into the water and says in the cutest British accent, "It's freezing. Do you mind?" Without waiting for an answer, she takes off her top to reveal she's not wearing a bra. She's just wading through the pool in tight booty shorts and nothing else. She then asks me to push her up the rock wall. So I'm just pushing her cute little butt, trying not to stare at her bare chest. She gets to the top, smiles, and then she's gone. I'm kicking myself the whole rest of the trip for not trying to get her number or something. When we get home and develop the disposable camera's pictures, there's a perfect picture of her standing in the middle of the canyon. Her friends must have found our camera and thought it'd be funny to take a picture. I kept that picture for a long time. Story 25. I had been having a rough few months at work and dealing with a lot of personal issues when I was driving to a side job one night, and I saw a homeless man walking between lanes asking for money. Normally, if I have spare change, I'll give it to them. The day before, I had a few bucks left over from morning coffee, so I threw the singles in my center console. As he walked up to the car, I held out the money. He seemed surprised, but then asked where my motorcycle was. I take that route all the time, and I usually take the bike if it's nice enough. Not to mention, I stick out a little. 6'4", 280, lots of tattoos. I told him I had left it at home. Right as the light turned green, he reached over, grabbed my arm, and said, "Whatever you're going through, trust me, it'll be okay." He gave me one of the most genuine smiles I've ever seen, then proceeded to shuffle to the sidewalk. I haven't seen him since, but whenever I pass that intersection, he's in my thoughts. I had to pull over a few blocks later because I almost broke down crying. I guess we were both supposed to be there that day, in that exact moment. Story 26. I had just gotten out of a just over year-long abusive relationship. I'm way better now. It's been several years since. To paint the picture of what I looked like then, the last time I had weighed myself, I was about 90 pounds at about 5'4", being 20 at the time. 24 now, and though I'm still very petite, I at least have meat back on my bones. My eyes were sunken in, and you could see every bone in my ribs, and my wrists stuck out worse than normal. I was extremely depressed. And to add insult to injury, I had to cut my hair at the time, so I was butchered to hell and back. And I had it dyed black. I looked like a beetle gone wrong. If anyone's curious for before and after pictures otherwise, I'm happy to post. I started attending cosmetology school a couple months after returning, but wanted to make a good first impression to everyone there. A friend suggested I go see a woman named Marlana, or Marlena, I still can't remember, at a salon that was tied in with the school I was about to attend. I was still fearful of making calls. I was so scared to go in public and have everyone see my face and my scars and who I had become. The staff was so sweet. I told her I needed my pixie shaped up, and that my hair was stark black, and I just needed it lightened as much as I could. Just brown would have been better. The black washed me out so badly and did nothing shy of enhance how sunken my eyes looked then. She sat me down, and it was a struggle for me to hold a conversation in general. My now ex forbade me from speaking to anyone, even my own family, without his consent. I had deteriorated as a person. Eventually, the cup runneth over, so to speak, and I started crying while she was cutting my hair. I told her about what had happened, that I had just come home from being in another state, the situation I was in, and that she was being so sweet to me the whole appointment. She stopped midway, put away her tools, and wrapped her arms around me in the chair and told me that I was home and I was safe. She told me how glad she was that I was not still there and how glad she was that I'm still here. Marlana, I'll never forget how sweet you were through that whole moment. Thank you again for being so sweet and so understanding. I don't know what made you give a total stranger a hug after she cried her eyes out and spewed her whole story to you, but you're an incredibly good person for doing so. 4 years later, and I still think about how heartwarming that was. Story 27. My parents used to take me camping at one of those edge-of-the-highway campgrounds that neighbor amusement parks. My parents were addicts and narcissists, so the trip wasn't for me, so we never went to the amusement parks. Instead, they would meet up with their trashy friends, get high and drunk, and F each other's spouses while I slept. I'd sneak out at night so I could not see or hear it. At this particular campground, there is a highway billboard sign in the back of the area. You could go pretty much over a fence and find yourself right up onto the sign. It was lit up super bright and was magical to my 11-year-old mind. That place became my sanctuary, and I was so used to having it to myself. One year, I went there on my first night at around 11 p.m. and found some college kids there, male and females who were camping at the site as well. Initially, they wanted me to get lost, but one girl looked at me and I swear she saw something in me. She talked the others to take me in. So for one glorious week, my nerdy 11-year-old self got to hang out with these college kids, all guarded by this beautiful young woman who I fell for immediately. We roasted marshmallows fireside, went for drives around town, and even broke into the campground general store for bug stuff when we ran out. We left cash. And yes, they even took me to the amusement park, and it was awesome. They left the day before we did, and I cried uncontrollably for so many different reasons. First, because they were gone, but mostly because they respected me as a human being and the feelings that come with that. The first time I think anyone did for me. They didn't say it to me, but they taught me to rise above my situation and keep moving with my life and don't look back. So, if you're somewhere in your early 50s and recall taking a little brown-haired boy on the Steamin' Demon at the Great Escape in Lake George, New York, sometime around 1987 or 88, I'm doing great now and live a happy and healthy life. And thank you for that week. Story 29. Years ago, when I was backpacking across Western Europe, I was just outside Barcelona, hiking in the foothills of Mount Tibidabo. I was at the end of this path, and I came to a clearing, and there was a lake, very secluded, and there were tall trees all around. It was dead silent, gorgeous, and across the lake I saw a beautiful woman bathing herself, but she was crying. I hesitated watching, struck by her beauty, and also by how her presence, the delicate curve of her back, the dark sweep of her hair, the graceful length of her limbs, even her tears, added to the majesty of my surroundings. I felt my own tears burning behind my eyes, not in sympathy, but in appreciation of such a perfect moment. She spied me before I could compose myself, but she didn't cry out. Instead, our eyes held and she smiled, enigmatically, fresh tears still spilling down her cheeks. I was frozen. I knew nothing about this woman, and yet, as we stood on opposite sides of a pool of water, thousands of miles from my own home and everyone I had ever known, I felt the most intense connection, not just to her, but to the earth, the sky, the water between us, and also to the entirety of mankind, as if she symbolized thousands of years of the human condition. I wanted to go to her, to comfort her, to probe this feeling of belonging I had never encountered before, but I couldn't, because I knew that if she spoke, that moment would be ruined, and I knew I would need the memory of that moment to carry me through the inevitable dark patches throughout my life. And so I watched her lower her hand, turn, and slowly walk to the shore opposite me. The rest of her perfect form was gradually revealed to me, and I held my breath as I watched her disappear behind a copse of trees near the water. I didn't follow her. In fact, I turned around. I knew there was nothing else we could experience together that would be more perfect than that moment, and it still remains the most profound experience of my life. Story 30. Late to the party, but here we go. This happened when my only biological child was around 3 months old. I had a major fight with my husband and left him. My baby and I were homeless and staying in a women's shelter at the time. I had gotten signed up for WIC, Women, Infants, Children, and was given a card to purchase formula. My son was on formula for babies that had digestive issues. The encounter happened at a nearby grocery store. I was at the front of the line to buy 3 of my allotted cans of formula. Behind me was a man about my age and his wife/girlfriend. I tried to swipe my card and it was rejected. I tried again and the same thing happened. I couldn't help it. I immediately burst into tears. My life was at rock bottom. It was ruined. I was separated from my other 3 kids, and I was going to ruin Charlie's life too. That's when the angel of a human being behind me spoke up and said, I'll pay for them. These cans of formula are like $40 each. I told him that too, in my shock. He turned to his wife, who just smiled and said, We've been there. I got this. I don't know who you are, but you saved me that day. You saved my son a lot of pain, which means the world to me. One day, I'll be able to pay it forward, just like you did. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. So that last sentence really symbolizes what it's all about. Pay it forward. When someone does something for you, you may not be able to pay it forward right there in that moment, but one day a time will come where you can do the same thing for someone else and just keep the chain of positivity going, and we'll make the world a better place. Story 31. I did a solo road trip around the south coast of Iceland last winter. I stopped for the night in Hofen and used the public pool there. They have signs everywhere that warn you not to be in the spa for long if it's cold outside, as you could make yourself ill, difference in temperatures. Needless to say, I was in there for a while and ended up vomiting in the bathroom when I got back inside. The lady who worked there found me and made sure I didn't pass out. She gave me a private room to lay in and checked on me periodically to make sure I was okay. Once I could stand without passing out, she set up a table for me next to her reception and made me drink coffee and eat biscuits until I was 100% better. This meant she ended up staying at work for almost an hour past closing to make sure a stranger was okay. I told her I was traveling alone, and she gave me her phone number and address just in case I needed help. Thank you for posting this question. I'd totally forgotten about this exchange, and it's nice to remember it again. Story 32. When I was about 22, I met a blonde woman from Las Vegas who had to be pushing 45, but was sexy as F. Fake everything, but done very well. We were talking as we were delayed by a few hours, and the girl with her was her friend. Through conversation, I found out she was a recently divorced escort, and she and her friend were on their way on a divorce moon away from it all. On the flight, by coincidence, we sat next to each other, and she wasn't wearing a lot of clothes and complained to me she's cold. So I put my left arm around her, and she put her right leg over my left leg. I brought a blanket on the plane, but it was very small, especially for 2 people, so we raised the seat operator between us and snuggled until we both fell asleep. We woke up a few hours later, and she took my hand and put it right in her crotch. She was wearing jean shorts, but private parts fully exposed. My leg was completely in pain and fell asleep from the weight of her leg, but here I was finger-banging this hot escort on a plane at 22 and having the time of my life. Eventually it became too painful and I had to shift out of there, and she suggested I walk it off. I got up and limped until feeling came back, and she got up also and all but shoved me into the bathroom behind us. She got in and pulled me in, sat down, told me to lock the door, dropped my pants, and proceeded to give me the best BJ of my life. I came in 5 minutes or so, and she swallowed every drop, then licked it clean and said thanks, then we left. She gave me her number and said look her up, and I must have heard wrong, or she gave me a fake number, because the number I put in my phone was to a non-working number. Story 33. I used to volunteer at a local retirement center, took CNA training, never really followed through with it after the certificate. One of the days I was there, I saw a gentleman in a wheelchair that I hadn't seen before. After talking for a bit, found out he was there for having a stroke and just needed some help getting back to health. We continued to talk and he offers to tell me his life story, start to finish. Didn't bother me much because I had really nothing else going on and I was going to be leaving soon anyways. This man was one of the most incredible people I've met. He grew up in Nebraska during the Dust Bowl back in the 1930s, lived on a farm, and was kind of a social outcast. Not because he was too weird, but just because he was very introverted. He received a letter in the mail stating that he was being drafted to fight the Nazis, and upon arriving at the training camp, he was instructed on how to fly the B-25 bomber. He was co-pilot and later was offered the position to become a pilot, but declined the position since his tour was almost up and the war was coming to an end. When the war ended, he returned to his home in Nebraska and married his high school sweetheart. The two of them both decided Nebraska didn't have too much for opportunities and moved to Michigan to help with the auto industry. At this point in the story, we had already been talking for 3 hours and it was time for me to get going. I told him that I would see him again in a few days and we can continue the story. When I went to leave, he said to me, "Remember my story, because I'm not going to be around forever to tell it." I nodded and went home. 2 days later, I returned to the home to find out the man had passed away that same night. TLDR, went to an old folks' home, a man told me his life story with World War II and passed away that night. Story 34. I was probably around 10 or 11 when me, my dad, and my sister took a day trip to the New England Aquarium in Boston. I was walking around the twisting path that loops up the big center tank in the main room when I stop and see one of the employees sitting by one of the square windows. She's a young woman, probably an intern in retrospect, and she's giggling in one of those ways that makes you just have to stop and see what's going on. She's taking her index finger and gently tracing it up the glass. Not tapping, just tracing, then going back to the bottom of the window and doing it again. And on the other side, this fish is following her finger up the glass each time she draws it upwards. She notices me and beckons me over, and says, "This one fish keeps swimming by every minute or so, and every time he stops and smiles at me, and he follows my finger." And really, the fish did have this kind of teasing grin on his face, like he almost knew what he was doing and how stoked he was making both of us. Eventually, he would swim away, but sure enough, in a minute or two, he'd be swimming around, see us and stop, and we'd do it again. It was probably one of the purest experiences of my life, which is why I remember it still. So we sat there for a few minutes, me and her, just playing with the fish until she had to go do something else, feed some tanks or whatever. And I stayed there until my dad found me while the fish was on one of his roundabouts. I explained it to my dad and he didn't believe me, until sure enough, the fish swam back with his charming, coy smile. I still remember how shocked and amazed my dad was, and how he told my mom the whole thing over dinner. I started writing this with the idea that the stranger was that fish, but I guess really it's about two strangers, the fish and that woman who showed me just how awesome things can be when you love your job. Story 35. I was tasked with taking my dad's boat from where it was docked to the boat ramp to meet him and put it on the trailer. It wasn't a great day weather-wise, and I wasn't happy having to do it. It was a blustery, crappy day on the water, and I was the only boat out. There's one bridge I have to go under to get to the boat ramp to meet my father. The bridge has a fishing bridge along the side. Approaching the bridge, I see 3 to 4 people frantically waving for me to come over. I slow down and head towards them. When I get close enough to hear them, they're shouting that a toddler has fallen into the water from the fishing bridge. It's at least 20 feet from the bridge to the water. I spin the boat to the area they're pointing. When I pull around the pilings, I see a man in the water struggling to hold a 2-year-old girl in the water. He's bloody from the barnacles on the bridge pilings, and he looks frantic and exhausted. I speed over and grab the little girl from his arms and give her to my mother. She bundles her up and holds her tightly to her chest. I reach for the man, and he's a handful to get onto the boat. The child is sobbing so hard that she has trouble getting her breath. The man is exhausted and doesn't move from where I drug him on board. I slowly motor to the shore and let them off. The girl had settled down and laid on my mother's chest the entire way in. The man didn't move, but he did explain how he had taken his daughter fishing, and 1 second she was next to him, and he spun around just in time to see her slip under the water's surface. The whole ordeal took 5 to 10 minutes. Not many words were said. I know I was in the right place at the right time, and I'm so thankful for that. I don't know what happened to the girl, but hopefully she's 23 years old now. In the 30-minute boat ride to the ramp, we were the only boat out there. Story 36. This happened a few weeks ago, so it's still fresh in my mind. A former friend had just told me she didn't want to be friends anymore after ducking and dodging me all week for reasons that were unbeknownst to me at the time. It was by far my lowest point that year, as I generally have a hard time making close friends, and having one toss you aside so cruelly when all you ever do is be nice to them. Anyways, I was on my way back home from said conversation late into the night, cutting across my university campus, and wondering if life was worth living and all other depressing thoughts, when I ran into an old couple that looked hopelessly lost. The poor souls had just come back from a wedding and had forgotten where they parked their car, and worse still, they had mixed up the names of the streets. Most people would offer condolences and be on their way home, as it was so late into the night, but I had nothing better to do, so I stuck around and helped them search for their car. We did eventually find it an hour later in an adjacent street to the one the old gentleman had initially thought of. But what really caught me off guard was the moment he actually saw the car and turned to me in tears. Here I had a fully grown man completely embrace me in tears, singing my praises when I was just trying to be nice and help some folk out. This moment will always stick out to me as the look of genuine relief and warmth made me realize that some people do appreciate others, and just generally are not afraid to say so. I never saw them again, and looking back, they probably thought I did them a huge favor, when in reality, I think they did me a bigger one. Story 37. I have 2. Both involve the NYC subway system. 1. I was leaving a Yankee game with my girlfriend. If you've ever done it, you'll know getting on the subway is chaotic. A British woman, who was alone, had trouble buying her Metro card for whatever reason. She was in front of me in line, and the people behind me were cursing at her to hurry up. She got obviously flustered and let me go. I refilled my card without a problem and turned around to see she had gone to the back of the line because the other people were yelling at her. I went up to her and told her to follow me, and I swiped her through with my card. She was so grateful, she cried and hugged me. 2. There was construction going on in the subways, typical, and I had to get off one stop, walk a couple blocks, and hop on another subway, free of charge, of course. Well, I didn't know this particular neighborhood well, and it was very crowded. I have a friendly face, and I guess that makes me approachable. So people always ask me for help/directions. Literally happens all the time. Anyways, a European lady asked for directions, and I told her I was going to the same place as her, she could follow me. But I was gonna confirm with this one random guy if we were going the right way. I asked this random guy, he says he'll take us there. We're chatting, and on the way he gets a phone call, and he straggles behind a bit. Suddenly, I hear a smack, and I turn around to see a huge guy standing over him screaming, "Don't ever bump into me." This poor guy was terrified. I'm not a big guy myself. I'm skinny and average height. I just have a deep-ass voice. I went to the big guy and said, "You're gonna keep walking now." And he shut up and ran. Now the scene is complete chaos. The European lady is clinging to my arm, terrified. The guy who got punched is on the floor regaining consciousness. He's confused and terrified. Some Arabic dude rides over on a bike, asks what direction the guy went, then says, "I'll go get the bad guy," then rides off into the sunset like a hero, never to return. I'm sitting on the ground next to the guy who got punched. He's dizzy and freaking out now. I sit him up and he's begging me not to leave his side, so I don't. He was helping me with directions. It was the least I could do. I gave him water, I called the police on my phone, and asked him if he had anyone nearby I could call. He gives me his phone. I call his brother, tell him the story, and sure enough, he's only 2 blocks away. The brother comes prancing into the scene, and he's the most flaming homosexual man I've ever seen. Picture Jonathan from Queer Eye jumping up and down and clapping between syllables that he's about to slice a female dog up. The European lady still has no idea where she's going, so she's not leaving my side. The police come and they ask me to give a report. The brother is asking who the hell I am. Then some random girl comes up and asks me if I'm Joe Jonas. And I was like, "Girl, what the F? No, not now." This whole scene was complete chaos. We'll never forget any of those strangers. I hope this doesn't get buried because this story is gold. Story 38. I should preface this by explaining I'm from a small town in the Midwestern US. I've always lived in the country. I've only been to big cities a few times in my 42 years, and this experience is hugely out of character for me, and to this day, I'm surprised by it. My husband and I were in a capital city in the US for our anniversary. There was a Starbucks on a corner near the hotel. As we walked in, I noticed a homeless woman sitting across from the door. She was clearly not high or drunk, unlike the guy on the other corner. She was knitting roses to sell. My husband's order is taking a while, and I got claustrophobic, so I went to stand outside. I'm absolutely not a people person, and I'm almost phobic of starting conversations. But I was leaning in the doorway, and I thought to myself, I can't just stand a few feet in front of this woman sitting on the sidewalk and not at least acknowledge her existence. So, next thing I know, I've stepped over to her, and I think I asked about the roses. I honestly can't remember what I said at first, but she was very nice. She was ill and disabled. Her husband was dead, and she'd become homeless. She was so sad, but dignified. My husband came out, and he joined the conversation. She told us more about her life and got very tearful, so I sat on the sidewalk next to her and took her hand. A younger girl approached and stood slightly to the side. I think she felt safer doing this because she was alone, but we were there so she didn't feel intimidated by the situation. Anyway, my husband and I are trying to encourage the woman, give her some hope. We believe in God, and so did she, so we talked about the Bible a bit. The younger girl excused herself for breaking into the conversation, but asked if perhaps we could pray with the woman. She agreed. The younger girl took the woman's other hand and we prayed, then talked a bit more. There on a sidewalk in the middle of a city sat and stood 3 strangers from vastly different lives, offering comfort and hope to another stranger in need of someone to just show they cared that she existed. In the end, I bought a knitted rose with all the cash I had on hand, gave the woman a hug, my husband hugged her, and we went back to the hotel. It's been 3 years. The rose sits on my windowsill above my kitchen sink, and I think of that woman nearly every day. Story 39. I was traveling the length of New Zealand, north to south, because I was 18 and had nowhere else to be. Arrived in Wellington with no money and planning to sleep in the train station until security found me. About 11 p.m., I heard some intense metal guitar coming from the underpass between the train station and the bus station across the road. Two dudes had unplugged a vending machine to do some busking, but after realizing there were only about 6 people in the building, they decided to just start shredding. I watched for a while, and then a Napoleonic security guard came bursting out of the shadows, threatening to call the cops on the 3 of us. Guilty by association. So we quickly unplugged the gear and legged it outside. We were going to sit in the bus station for a bit until a bus driver who hadn't started his shift led us into the staff lunch area out back. He said he'd been listening from outside and knew the security guard was a jerk, then gave us a free ride across town. As we pulled out of the station, 3 cop cars pulled in with lights and sirens blaring, so the guard must have really talked up what we'd been doing. I got off the bus 2 minutes later and never saw them again. Don't even know their names. Story 40. Last year, or maybe 2016, I suspected someone was following me, so I tried to run away and make 3 turns. Reach the crossing and turn once so he can't see you, run to the next crossing and turn again so he'll have doubts about which direction you chose this time, and reach a 3rd crossing and turn again and he won't be able to find you. So he'll lose sight of me and would look for easier victims. The fact is, running on heels is easier said than done, despite what Resident Evil 4 made you think, and your shoes having shorter, thicker heels, not stilettos. The thing is, I face-planted on the sidewalk halfway to my next and last turn before I could be sure I was safe and could slow down. I tried to continue as I was close to my house, just 2 blocks away, and didn't feel like I needed urgent hospital care, and objectively I didn't. But 2 women who were on their house's steps didn't share my opinion, and one of them came to my rescue and forced me to go back with them and give her a number to call so someone I knew could pick me up. So my mother drove to where I was, took me home to clean and disinfect my lip, and helped me get some urgent dental care to fix my only serious wound, a chipped tooth. Neither of us remembers these women's address, so I could go back and thank them properly, but I pray for them occasionally. Story 41. Was studying abroad in Copenhagen and having kind of a hard time. I'm slow to make friends, so even though the school I was at was all Americans, 2 months in, I was still super lonely. I wound up booking tickets to see a metal band I really liked in Arum, outside of Amsterdam, on a Thursday night when I had class the next morning at 10ish. So I flew to Amsterdam, took the train an hour and a half, missed the first opener because I originally got on the wrong train, then repeated the whole thing back to get 2 hours of sleep in Schiphol while my phone died so I could still make it to class. The memorable stranger part was while I was at the concert. I'm not big into mosh pits, but I like being at the front, kind of playing guard for the other people and still enjoying seeing the band live. While I was there was this redhead girl that I could barely see with all the lights and metalhead hair flying around. She bumped into me far more than was necessary considering the concert. We wound up actually dancing as best we could during this concert. As soon as it ended, I totally lost track of her and had to catch the last train back to Amsterdam, so I didn't even have a chance to look. It meant a lot to me to have that kind of connection with someone at a point in time when I was super lonely, and even cooler to have it happen in a foreign country doing something that I really love. Means a bit more than normal because about 1.5 years previous, I'd been essayed in a bathroom and hadn't been able to deal with physical contact with people very well, to the point that bumping into people on buses wasn't pleasant. That concert, though, marked the change in that, however, and really meant a lot. Story 42. I was going through a hard time. My girlfriend at the time had been cheating on me. I'd confronted her. She begged for another chance. I gave it to her. She did it again. She wanted me to take her back, but I told her I didn't know. My self-esteem was at an all-time low. I just couldn't understand what I'd done to deserve her infidelity. At the same time, I was afraid of being alone. I had gone out to a bar after a work function where I had to dress up because I didn't want to let the formal gear go to waste, but I was all alone because all my friends had other plans. I wound up running into a very attractive female acquaintance from an old job who, much to my surprise, told me I looked great. See previous comment about destroyed self-esteem, and asked me to keep her company because she too was flying solo after a bad breakup. We had some fun, and I started gaining a little confidence back. I started to think it would lead somewhere, but she told me she was still living with her ex, and I decided to steer clear of that until she'd moved on a little more than that. No sense in me moving on if she wasn't. But still, we were having a good time, and I had nothing better to do. So I went with her to another bar where a band she wanted to see was playing. We were having fun, laughing, doing a little light flirting, and I started to feel a good bit less miserable. As happens when you're drinking, I needed to use the bathroom. On my way, I passed the bar and saw a positively gorgeous girl sitting with her friends there and noticed she was looking at me. Not just looking, but watching, intently. When I made eye contact, she smiled and looked away for a moment before looking back and grinning when she saw I was still looking at her. I gave her a little smirk and a nod and continued on to the restroom where I did my business and thought about how I might do better in the single world than I thought. On the way out of the bathroom, a hand grabbed my tie as I passed the bar. I spun around to see that it was the gorgeous stranger, and before I could say anything, she was kissing me. I almost resisted out of loyalty to my ex, but this girl was gorgeous, and she clearly wanted me. So I kissed her back, and my God, it was good. This girl was damned sexy, and there was more passion in our kiss than I thought possible between two people with their clothes still on. After a few moments, we pulled back from each other. She brushed my hair with her fingers, straightened my tie, and said, "I'm sorry, but I had to do that. You were just too damned irresistible. I promise not to tell your girlfriend." Before I could gather my wits, she squeezed my ass, gave me a look up and down, and walked to the restroom. I thought about waiting for her to tell her that I didn't have a girlfriend, and maybe we should pick up where we left off. But I was always a relationship guy and not a one-night stand guy, and didn't like my odds of not being cheated on again by a woman who thought I was in a committed relationship and didn't know my name when she stuck her tongue in my mouth the first time. What I did do is text my ex that we were never, ever getting back together, and that she effed up so bad because it turned out I was damn desirable and could do a lot better than her. That girl, whomever she was, gave me the confidence boost I needed to cut ties with a toxic person because she reminded me that I was an attractive dude who would have no trouble finding someone else to love him. That was something I'd lost because, in addition to being a cheater, my ex was psychologically abusive and had utterly eroded my opinion of myself. It's been 8 years since then. I've been married the past 7, and my wife and I are expecting our 3rd child. I'd like to think of that mysterious stranger as a kind of superheroine who goes around bestowing confidence to those in need. In all actuality, she may have just been a girl who needed to feel attractive to an attractive stranger too. I'll never know. Story 43. This also doubles as my go-to small world story. On a plane from Heathrow to Sydney via Singapore when I was 20, I was seated next to a rather attractive woman a few years older than me. I was returning to NZ after a month-long trip around Europe, as well as visiting family in the UK. At first, we paid each other little mind other than a few pleasantries. About halfway into the flight to Singapore, I pulled out one of the travel books I had bought. For this trip, I had brought with me 4 books from NZ to read, but I exchanged them at bookstores for other interesting reads. This was one of the exchanged books I got from a store in Heilbronn, Germany. It's a smallish city with some pretty architecture, but I visited because an exchange student friend of mine lived there. Now, about 15 minutes after I opened the book up and continue reading, I noticed my neighbor peering over at me. She asked me if I liked the book, and also asked where I'd bought it. See, she had just finished reading it, and had done what I had done, exchanged it for another book. Turns out, she had been to that same bookstore in a small town of another country in Europe. She was from Western Australia, returning home after a trip, visiting family in the UK, and an exchange student friend in Heilbronn. The book that I held in my hands was her book. She even showed me the receipt. For the rest of the flight, we were best friends. It's hard to have such a coincidental moment like that without being taken in by some kind of spiritual connection. However, when we both deboarded the plane, that was the last we saw or heard from each other. Some things are better left a mystery, and that meeting was definitely one of them. Story 44. Went to visit my sister in England. We decided to take a day trip to London as I had never been and she had only been once. We get off the bus and go catch the changing of the guards, which was cool. We were watching it as this elderly gentleman, maybe around his 80s, starts talking to us. Very nice and knows everything about London as he grew up there. Well, we thought after the changing of the guards we would go our separate ways. We were happily wrong. This guy tells us that he's taking his usual morning stroll around the city, and if we would like to tag along. We agreed, and it turned into a 5-hour walk to all the spots we would never have found. He took us to his favorite pub and bought us pints and sandwiches. Took us to see parts of the old Roman city. Parts of the city from the war you can see where half the building is newish and half pre-war. He told us his life story, which was sad but fascinating. He showed us the tricks of using the tube, and literally talked for hours about the hidden gems of London and what it was like to grow up there. We got on the tube to go see another part of the city, and at a stop, he got up and said it was a pleasure and we made his morning, but his knees were old. We told him that he made our trip, and tried to give him something for his time, or at least pay him back for the drinks and food he gave us. He politely refused, gave us a hug, and walked away. That gentleman will forever be one of the best parts of my travels, and wish him a best and happiest happy life. Story 45. I was at a big car get-together earlier this summer, and I love rat rods. I spend most of my time hanging around them. A random guy and I were talking about one that had a soda tap in the dashboard. He mentions that he and his wife were building a rat rod, and she would love the soda tap. I expected him to go get her. Instead, he pulls out pictures of the progress of his rat rod and starts showing me all the work they did. They were building it together, just them, no one else. He starts telling me the story. For every detail, each piece added, he had a photo, from the purposefully added scuffs, the whole way to the Rouge crate engine. We get to a picture and he hesitates and says that at a point, work stopped for a bit. His voice was getting shaky. He says his wife was diagnosed with a condition that quickly onset and left her unable to speak or walk. He tells me as soon as she settled into the lifestyle, they were right back at the car. He did the work and she sat with him every moment of the build. He stops again to tell me that she passed away before they finished it, and she had 2 wishes. First was he finishes the car. Second is that she gets to go on the first ride in the car, dead or alive. The car was amazing looking and nearing completion. He showed me so many more pictures of a second 1969 Camino he was restoring. He said that he was secretly building it as a surprise. It was the car he took her to prom in and the car they rode to and from their wedding in. Both cars were amazing and you could tell every little detail mattered on them. Each decision was made with care and thought. As quickly as we met, he disappeared into the sea of cars. I never even got his name, but damn, will that story and the car stick with me. I'll look for them every year I attend. Story 46. 3 years ago, nearly to the day, after finding out the person I'd spent the last 9 years of my life with had been cheating on me for quite some time, I took a trip to Wales, specifically Llandudno. In Llandudno, there's this cliff/mass of land called the Great Orme. Whilst walking around it, I crossed the wall and walked to the edge, staring down a high drop onto a jagged rocky beach into the Irish Sea. I must have stood there for about an hour, willing myself to step off, when I hear rustling behind me. When I turned, it was a little Yorkshire Terrier, and a little way away was an old lady, around 70s. I felt ashamed and uncomfortable, so I sat down, stroked the dog. She never said a word. I just wanted her to leave me alone, but that dog just wouldn't F off. After another 10 minutes or so, I got up and walked back to the path. Her and the dog followed. Still, not a word was said. For the next 2 hours, she and her dog followed me around the Orme until we reached Llandudno proper, and she just walked off. No words. She knew what was going on, and I thank her for not berating me or trying to calm me down. I'll never forget the sadness on her face or her stoicness. I have been back to Llandudno a few times since I walked the Orme, partially to say F you to a dark time in my past, and hugely to hope I find her and her dog and thank her proper. Story 47. Obligatory sorry for the long post / this will probably get buried. Backstory. 2 months prior to this story, my mom's car died and I was incapacitated from a bad appendix, so I let her borrow mine. She emptied all her stuff into my car because she junked hers, and I, being somewhat lazy, never fully gave back all her stuff. I was coming home from work and driving on the highway. Traffic was going about 55 to 60 mph. I came around a bend and saw a woman and 4 young kids frantically trying to flag someone down. No one was pulling over, so I did. At the time, I was thinking, why is this woman allowing her kids on the side of the freeway? They're going to get killed. But when I stopped, she pounded in the door to let her in. The kids were crying and yelling something about, "It's going to explode!" I unlocked the door and she threw the kids in and said her van was on fire. I looked in the rear view and sure enough, flames were shooting out from under the hood. I told her to buckle the kids in, one was in the car seat, in case we got hit, because there was literally 6 to 10 inches between my car and speeding tractor trailers. As she was buckling the kids in the back, she looked on the floor and said, "OMG, you have a fire extinguisher." It was my mom's, and I forgot I had it. I told her to use it, and she was able to put the fire out, while I calmed the kids down and called 911. The police and fire came out and shut down one lane of the highway, and I was able to safely get out. The woman hugged me in tears and thanked me. We were both taken aback by how it seemed that I was meant to be there with that extinguisher, which accidentally was in my car, at that exact moment. Thank God I don't clean up my car regularly. Story 48. I was in Colombia for a wedding. I didn't really know the bride or groom too well. I was the date of someone else. Since I had no friends and my date was out with the wedding party, I decided to go out and find a hairdresser to stop my hair from frizzing up for the ceremony. I asked an older man selling necklaces by the road if he knew of a hair salon nearby. He said he'd call his daughter, and a 15-year-old rolled in on a bicycle. She took me to a hair salon and said I was a family friend. We chatted for a while and I bought her a soda. I really enjoyed talking to her and learning of her life there. After I left the salon and was halfway through the wedding evening, I realized I left my camera in the hotel. I ran over there and tripped over the cobblestone cracks. I tore open my knee and someone rushed to me. It was the older gentleman from earlier. He helped patch up my knee and we had a great chat. I always think of that day and send him and his daughter good vibes. Story 49. There was a man in the Sherwin-Williams paint supply store about 2 years ago who weirded me out in a bizarre and beautiful way. Honest to God, I got the feeling that he may be a time traveler or an angel. Nothing negative, but certainly something very, very otherworldly. Maybe he just wasn't from around here, and he gave me some very bad news. I should explain. My wife and I had just purchased a new home, and the seller had trashed the place when she moved out. Literally, there was trash everywhere. She'd also put holes in the walls, torn out some light fixtures, and lied to us and our inspectors about the conditions of the pipes and roof. Have you seen The Money Pit? Probably not, because goddamn, kids these days don't know from quality. But our new house was a bit like that. And if you've seen that movie, well, bully for you, old chap. Anyway, we spackled that place up like some sort of construction-themed bukkake video, and we needed paint in order to cover up the patches. As the proud owners of a then 2-year-old, we brought him along. Mostly this was due to the fact that current laws make it relatively illegal to leave your kid unattended, and, because law trumps sense, we decided taking him to the figurative birthplace of chemical odors was a wise decision. And this is where, as we peruse the odor-reducing hospital issue, demi-gloss, and otherwise hyphenated options for said toddler's room, we encountered the stranger. He was about 5 feet 8 inches tall, of an olive complexion with slicked back, short, dark hair. He wore a gray suit and tie. More notably, perhaps, was the fact that over that suit he had a forest green sash, as if he'd just arrived from winning a beauty pageant sponsored by High Life magazine, and his sash was festooned with what appeared to be military medals for service, but unlike any I've ever seen. Not in an unreal sense, but just clearly not American military medals. Maybe they were Prussian or Iranian? I don't know. It's important to note that my son, who was with us in a stroller, is objectively the cutest child who ever lived. This is not my personal belief, but rather something that strangers have been telling me ever since the baby was born. The guy at 7-Eleven gave him a free Slurpee last week because he's, quote, just too adorable, and I, after nearly 4 decades of life on this blue marble we call home, have never once received a free Slurpee, even when I tried to redeem a free Slurpee's worth of points from my 7-Eleven rewards app. We don't accept the app points here, she told me. Grrr. Yet my son, who has been known to make women's ovaries hurt, cause grown men to weep, and convinced other children to hand over their candy with only a smile, gets free crap all the effing time like he's some kind of handout Jesus. Do you have any idea how hard it's going to be to convince this kid that hard work is important? He gets everything for free. It's so frustrating. But I digress. The point is that after the 50th unaffiliated woman has walked up to you on the street and asked if your baby is a model, no ma'am, he's a baby, you start to realize that perhaps your parental concept of how cute your kid is may not be based on bias alone. So after I noticed the flare-spangled stranger at the paint store, and I noticed him noticing me, and then the baby, I immediately knew what was coming next. Or at least I thought I did. May I? The man asked the question of me while gesturing towards my son. While I'm fairly confident that I did not roll my eyes because, contrary to how I write, I'm actually fairly self-controlled in real life, I did give a sort of resigned half-nod, knowing full well that what would follow was a lifting of the child, an announcement of how obscenely cute he was, a question aimed at me wondering if he had an agent, a statement aimed at my wife expressing that the child clearly had her looks, thanks for that particular confidence booster, numerous a-holes, and then a repeated affirmation that the child was so cute you would want in some way or another to ingest him into your own being like Count Dracula of yore. Instead, however, the stranger placed his hand on my son's head, softly, almost like a benediction or anointment, and held it there for 2 or 3 seconds. The stranger then removed his hand, smiled, looked me in the eyes and said, and I quote, "He is a prince. Thank you." And then the stranger walked out of that paint store without having purchased anything, and he disappeared. Not into thin air or anything so absurd, he just walked around the corner. I probably should have said that. The stranger walked out of that paint store without buying anything and then walked around the corner. Better. The way he had said, "He is a prince," has stuck with me. It was not said like a compliment, but like a statement of fact, as if this was knowledge that the world had bestowed upon him. perhaps as a result of winning the Greenpeace sash of being able to wear a gray suit well. It felt more like the stranger was verifying it to himself, to me, to my wife, I'm not sure. But it was unusual, and it has stayed with me. And when I think about that incident, all I can say is, God damn it, I really effing hate how hard it's going to be to convince my effing prince of a son that hard work is important. F my life. Story 50. I was flying out of a small regional airport to make a connection in Minneapolis one windy day a few years ago. The wind was too strong for the small aircraft to safely depart, so our flight was canceled. I was trying to figure out how I could get up to Minneapolis to catch my connecting flight when a seemingly nice gentleman walked over and offered me a ride. He said he didn't want to miss his connecting flight either, so he would drive up there and figure it out later. After telling my boyfriend at the time about this, and giving him the man's license plate number, I accepted the man's ride and we hopped into his pickup truck. It was a bit awkward at first, but I never really felt unsafe. We ended up having a wonderful conversation the whole ride up, about 1.5 hours. He seemed like a simple man. We talked about traveling, food, music, and living in Wisconsin. He listened intently when I shared my stories, and then he started sharing stories about his son, and specifically mentioned how he travels a lot to play music. I didn't think much of it at the time until we had about 10 minutes left of our ride. The man asked if he could put one of his son's songs on for me to listen to. I obliged. I instantly recognized the song. Turns out, this kind guy is the father of Justin Vernon, or the lead singer of Bon Iver. I only had about 5 minutes to gush to him about how talented his son is and how much I adore his music. Then we got to the airport, he dropped me off at my terminal and wished me well. I thanked him again for the ride and we went our own ways. Reflecting back on this, it was nice to just feel free and safe enough to hop in a car with a stranger and see this man as just a really proud dad. Story 51. Something I've actually never shared before, even somewhat anonymously on here. It was a couple of years ago now. I was out in the city drinking and my girlfriend at the time ended up having too much to drink. Long story short, we ended up having an argument which ended with her telling me to, quote, just F off and leave me alone. I don't want to be with you. I left the club, wandered around, and ended up sitting on a curb in a quieter area not too far away, basically to gather my thoughts and just process what had happened. A guy I've never met before comes over to me and asks if everything's okay, as he said he saw me sitting there and could tell things weren't going so great for me. Needless to say, I ended up talking to this guy about the crap storm that occurred that night, and he not so directly told me he could tell that wasn't the full story of why I was so down. That led to me telling him about my little sister self-unaliving, a lot of the circumstances surrounding that, how I felt like I had no one, and just how broken I felt. I hadn't, and still haven't, ever really had a discussion like that with anyone, neither friend, family, or therapist, so it was surprising but incredibly heartwarming to know this guy actually gave a crap about me. I ended up crying. Again, something I don't really do. And he ended up crying too, and we just talked for a good hour or so. When it came time for us to part ways, we hugged. He told me to keep my chin up and look after myself, and I told him he was one of the nicest and most genuine people I had ever met. It makes me feel sad thinking about it, especially because the next morning I couldn't even remember his name. I wish I could say thank you to what he did for me that miserable night. If by some miracle you see this, I can't express how much that meant to me, and it's something I won't ever forget. Story 52. In a very dark moment, a kind stranger made the sun rise twice for me. I was 19 and cycling/working my way around New Zealand. 10 out of 10. Definitely go there if you have a chance. After some hiking around the Queenstown area, I decided to check with my parents in the Netherlands. This was before internet/mobile, so I hadn't spoken to them in a few weeks. Hear that my mother has aggressive liver cancer, is not responding anymore, and has maybe a few days left. Her last words up till then were that she would like to say goodbye to her son. If you drill a hole straight down through the planet in NZ, you end up in the Netherlands. You literally cannot be further away. My travel insurance arranges flights back. Queenstown to Christchurch to Auckland to Los Angeles to Amsterdam. 72 hours in total. Last thing I hear on the airport phone in LA is that Mum woke up for a bit and they told her I was coming. Then she slid back into unconsciousness. During sleep time on that flight, I was pacing up and down the aisles. Hadn't slept 60 plus hours. A young flight attendant notices me and asks me if I'm okay. So I tell my story, and she tears up, saying she lost a relative recently and hugs. That hug deserved a capital H. Me. I feel like a load is lifted from my shoulders. She then takes me back into the galley, smiles, and asks me to wait a moment. After a few minutes, she brings me to the cockpit and says I can sit there for a while if I like. I like. So we all start chatting. The pilots explain some of the flight systems to me, and they do a great job being a bro to me. We're over the Atlantic. It's rapidly getting light outside, and the sun pops up over the horizon while we float over a pristine world. The pilot winks and says, quote, "Would you like to see something really cool?" He then curves the plane to the north while descending. The sun drops behind the horizon again. He gets back to the original course and up comes the sun again. I watch in awestruck silence, feeling closer to infinity / God / the universe / everybody than my atheist self ever has before. Sleep deprivation might have had something to do with this. I made it home by afternoon in the early winter, still in my summer shorts. When she heard me, my mom woke up and we were able to talk for maybe 15 minutes and say our goodbyes. She then slid into a coma and died that evening. We buried her on my 20th birthday. That flight crew did something really nice for me and got me through what felt like an endless night. The memory of that magical sunrise really helped me in the months after. Story 53. I'm very late to this, and I know it won't be read by many people, but when I first graduated from college, my mental health was such a mess I had to move back in with my parents. When my anxiety gets really bad, I get a little agoraphobic, and I panic when I have to go places alone. One of the first things my therapist asked me to do was take myself to the movies. I went to the local dollar theater to catch the matinee for Winter Soldier. There was one other person in the theater with me, a woman who looked to be in her 50s or early 60s. On the way out, she caught my eye and smiled at me and asked if that was my first time seeing it and how I'd liked it. It was her fourth time seeing it, and she told me she's always loved comics so much, and she loves seeing them become more mainstream and seeing more and more girls partaking because everything is for everyone, and time tells that anything can become the cool thing to do. So love what you love, do no harm, and always be unashamed of who you are and what you love. I have no idea who she was, but I'm so grateful she made one of the first steps in my recovery journey so positive. She could have chosen to just leave, but instead she chose to share her enthusiasm and passion and remind me that people aren't always out to judge you. So thank you, Winter Soldier friend. Story 54. So this summer, my family and I went on a cruise to Bermuda. We were docked at Bermuda for 3-ish days. We all spent the first day at the beach. The second day, my girlfriend and I planned to visit the zoo/aquarium. Might have just been an aquarium. That part of the day is a bit unclear. My family had resolved to meet up for dinner on the ship every night, so we knew we had to be back by 6. Well, after sleeping in too late, waiting for people to get ready, etc., we got off the boat way too late. Eventually, we figured out where we needed to go and took the ferry to another island nearby. Upon arriving, we quickly realized that between paying for a taxi to the aquarium and actually paying admission, neither of us had enough cash on us. At this point, she was starting to get noticeably frustrated that we had wasted most of the day, so I took out our map and suggested the first thing I saw, the botanical gardens. It looked like it was far, but not quite too far to walk, maybe 3-ish miles. So we set out to walk to the gardens. Mistake number 1. As soon as you leave the touristy, rich part of that particular island, there aren't really sidewalks. Apparently, people don't really expect you to walk across the island. People were speeding by us, and traffic was just a mess in general compared to home, so we had started to consider giving up at this point. We took out the map to assess the situation better and see if it was worth continuing. We look up to find this man walking towards us, clearly a local, clearly recognizes that we're clueless tourists. He was an average height, skinny black man wearing work clothes. He looked about 30 to 35 maybe. He asks us if we needed any help. We explain that we were going to walk to the botanical gardens, and he just gives us this look of, whoa, you guys have no idea what you're getting into. He then starts to give us directions and stops a couple times to explain that he's having a hard time remembering because he just got back from the hospital where he had staples removed from his head. He finally gives up on giving us directions and goes, look, how about I just take you there? Naturally, I look at my girlfriend like, oh, we should probably not, which he sees and responds with, look, it's no big deal. I can take you there right now. You can give me $5 and we'll call it even. Look, I've got nothing better to do anyway. This is literally the situation that everyone always tells you to avoid. Never talk to strangers and all that, but I just kind of got this feeling he was a nice guy. He seemed all right. Shady as anything, but nice enough. After a lot of, I don't know, I agreed to go with him. Mistake number 2. So as we're walking along, he introduced himself as Dimitri and told us a little bit about his family and answered any questions we had about the island. He kept saying stuff like, "Oh, come on, ask away. This is my island. I'm your tour guide today." This whole time, my girlfriend just starts walking ahead, and every time she did, I would try to subtly grab her arm and pull her behind me to keep a buffer between her and the stranger. She never took the hint. The whole time he's talking, I'm going through every scenario of who this guy could be and what he's really doing with us. I genuinely thought it could be the end. Spoiler, I didn't die. Think about it. This guy, who we've never met, wants to take us on a tour of the island, away from the densely populated touristy area, where no one will hear our screams. I was a bit terrified. He continued to tell us about how he worked as a landscaper, and he could name almost every plant on the island. He would tell us which ones were poisonous, which ones had thorns, etc. He even picked a few for my girlfriend. Every time he picked her a new one, he would take the old one from her and go, "You're still holding on to that one?" and throw it into the street. He was a funny guy like that. Every 3 to 4 plants, he would tell us that he knows what this one is, but he can't remember because his head is feeling weird because he just had staples removed from his head. That kept coming up over and over again. We actually passed the hospital he went to, and he started to talking to an elderly lady he knew for a minute. Just some small talk. He met other people he knew too. They all seemed like nice people as well, which kind of built his credibility in my mind. They all kept saying stuff along the lines of, "Hey Dimitri, I saw your video last week," and they'd just start cracking up. To some of the other men, he replied a friendly F you. We started to warm up to Dimitri once we saw how many people knew him and talked to him like a regular guy. Of course, we asked what this video was and he completely avoided the question like it was embarrassing. But hey, we tried. We made it to the garden alive eventually. It had already closed, but he took us in anyway. He told us he used to do landscaping work there, so he knew all the good spots, which he took us to. At one point, he asked us if we wanted our picture taken. Of course we did, because it was an awesome view. My girlfriend gave him her phone to take the picture, and we could both see the look of, "This guy's gonna run off with that phone," in each other's eyes. He just took the picture though. Granted, he was not the best photographer. We kept the pics, of course, but most of them have his thumb in the corner. I seriously may frame them with his thumb there, just because of how outrageous and memorable this all was. While we were in the park, he sat down on a wall for a smoke break. He had a big bag of tobacco, which he used to roll his own cigarettes. At this time, he told us that he was also a poet, and then recited a poem that he wrote about kids driving their motorcycles too fast. It's a thing in Bermuda. And another about the power of the mind. They were actually pretty good. After a smoke break, he took us through the rest of the garden and told us that if he was still working there, it would look way nicer. He took great pride in his landscaping work. The last thing he showed us in the garden was a rubber tree. He insisted we swing on the vines. We got pics of that too. On the way back to the city where our ferry was, he asked us about ourselves. The typical, how did you meet, what did you do for a living, etc. We joked around a little, and we're genuinely just having a good time with this guy at this point. I guess we figured if he was going to kill us, he would have done it by now, and he really was a super nice guy the whole time. Around this time, I asked him why he was going so far out of his way to take us to the garden, and he tells us again, "Look, man, like I told you, I got nothing better to do today, so I can take you around. It's no problem. All I ask for you is $5, and maybe we can get a beer." I noticed immediately that his fee was going up because I'm incredibly cheap. But I agreed anyway to his proposal. Later, it came up again and he goes, "Look man, all I'm asking for is $5, a beer, and one single cigarette. It's no big deal." I was beginning to feel like I was being scammed, but I didn't dare call him on it. This was still kind of an odd situation, even though he seemed so nice. We finally get back into the city, and once again, he's greeted by a bunch of his friends here and there. We walk into the liquor store and he picks out a beer and asks the cashier, who he also knew, for a single cigarette. I paid with my credit card because I needed cash for the ferry. Part of me thought this was the moment I'd be scammed. Maybe it was a setup to get my credit card info and the cashier was in on it. We left the store and we kept on our way to the dock, which we could see at this point, and we see this old man with a straggly beard, missing teeth, etc. All the telltale signs of a homeless person/drug addict. Dimitri knew this guy too. The man whispered something to Dimitri, and Dimitri turned to us and told us to wait right there. Then he walked back into the liquor store, leaving us with this homeless man. Surely this was the setup. There would be more homeless men that would come out of the alley and rob us. We were starting to get really worried. Some of the locals, these are the first white locals in the story, they were dressed in expensive surfer-like clothes and had a bit of a Russian accent. Walking by on the street, looked at us and said, "Hey, be careful, this man's a drug addict." But they didn't stop or anything. They couldn't really be bothered that much, it seemed. Eventually, Dimitri came out of the liquor store with another beer and gave it to the man. He explained that the owner wouldn't sell it to the other man. He walked us all the way back to the dock, which he totally didn't have to do. We thanked him and said our goodbyes, and I paid him $10 instead of $5. Then he just left. That was it. No scam, I wasn't robbed. I even kept an eye on my credit card when I got home, and nothing strange has been charged other than that one purchase at the liquor store. He was genuinely just a nice guy. I couldn't even believe it. As soon as he walked away, we stepped in line for the ferry. We just looked at each other and we were like, F, did that seriously just happen? We just did everything that you're not supposed to do. All that being said, there's some loose ends. If any Redditors of Bermuda are out there and know Dimitri, we have to know what that video was. We still think about it. Also, just tell him we said hi. He was awesome. Overall, best single day of any vacation I've ever had. Story 55. I doubt anyone will read this, but here's mine. During college, my then girlfriend, now wife, would go home to Texas for the summer. Like many young relationships, the distance would rock our relationship to its core. One summer, I flew to Texas to visit her. Leaving was hard since we both wanted to try and make things work, but the odds were against us. I flew back home late one night in a flight with enough space no one sat in the middle seats. The girl who sat next to me looked really sad when we got seated. We started talking to pass some time. Before you know it, and sharing with her about my trip, I asked her what she's traveling for, and she started to cry. She had just left an abusive relationship and headed to the West Coast and family. A little about me. I was playing college football at the time. I'm 6'5", was about 290 pounds. For some reason, I moved to the middle seat and put my arm around her to comfort her. She cried on my shoulder for a while, and we both ended up falling asleep. We woke up when we landed in Albuquerque. She thanked me for making her feel safe. I hugged her and wished her luck. Got off the plane and never saw her again. I can't tell you much about what she looked like. She could walk up to me tomorrow and I wouldn't recognize her, but I think about her every now and again. I hope she's doing better. I hope the West Coast was everything she wished for. Story 56. This is late to the party, but I thought it fit well. I was in Las Vegas for my sister-in-law's birthday, and my best friend and I were sharing a room. Well, it was getting pretty late. I would say midnight, and we were all pretty drunk. My brother and his wife wanted to go to the club, but my best friend was pretty far gone by this point, so I got him to the room and put him to bed with some food and the TV on. Well, I wasn't done for the night, so I sat at some of the penny slots and was getting free drinks. Well, a guy with a mohawk and no shoes was walking by and I smiled at him. Next thing I know, he just sits down next to me and we start talking. He had a quart of cheap whiskey and cigarettes, so we were just having a great time, putting some money in the slots once in a while so the drinks would keep coming, lol. At one point, he went to the bathroom and a creepy old dude sat next to me and was being weird. When he came back, I introduced him as my husband because that seemed the best way for this old guy to leave us alone. Well, the old guy wants to hear about us more, so we both started making crap up about our relationship. We were on our 5th anniversary, we got married in Vegas, and we had 3 dogs. Well, after the old guy left, we decided to go ahead and get married because our imaginary life sounded good. We wandered through like 3 casinos trying to find a chapel. No luck, and we were both getting pretty tired. It was like 5 in the morning, so we decided to go back to our rooms and meet up later to get married. When I wake up later, I rethink the whole marriage thing, but wanted to see him again, but realized that we hadn't said where we were going to meet up. We didn't exchange numbers or room numbers, so there wasn't really any way to get a hold of each other. I didn't even remember his name, but to this day, I wondered what would have happened had we found a chapel. I would have woke up with a husband that had a mohawk and no shoes, but it was not meant to be. But I will always have that magical night with a guy who I didn't even hold hands with, but fell a little bit in love with. Story 57. Oh boy. We met on a work trip about 6 months before I was scheduled to get married. She was Italian, smart and beautiful. She was living in London. I was living in New York with my fiancé, and we were standing against a wall at some crazy dive bar in San Francisco while our coworkers danced and sung to whatever was playing over the speakers. Within 5 minutes of saying hello, I was already thinking and asking her to run away with me. I jokingly said it out loud, and she looked at me dead in the eye and said, "Where to?" I melted. We shared more in that conversation than I've shared with women that I've had genuine relationships. Kindred spirits probably comes as close as I can to explaining the feeling. Through clouds of weed, smoke, and cans of Pabst, we found ourselves sitting in the back of an Uber with a few other coworkers, heading back to their hotel. I wasn't staying there, or at least didn't have a reservation. We pulled up and I let her go. We hugged, she kissed my ear, and asked me if I was sure that I didn't want to stay. I thanked her and got back in the car. That was the closest I've ever come to effing up my relationship, but the connection I had with that woman was just so insane. Maybe in a different timeline. Story 58. For me, it's a really shameful one. About 8 years ago, I took a trip to London with one of my good friends. We were 2 young women walking around the city having a great time. We got on the subway and were having a great time. It was pretty crowded, but we were sitting down talking. I looked down the train and saw this guy looking at us. He was sort of grinning and seemed kinda cued into us talking, like maybe he was checking us out or something. I said to my friend in a voice where I thought only she would hear me, "Do you see that guy? His pants are way too tight for him." Because, honestly, he was a bigger built guy, and his pants were honestly just a size or two too small. And I didn't mean it in a malicious way. It was more like a, "Oh, honey, who dressed you this morning?" kind of tease, and it was only meant for my friend to hear. But as soon as I said it, I looked back and his face changed completely to one of horror. He totally heard me and was humiliated. I felt so effing bad. I still think back to this and my heart hurts. I feel like such a moron for saying something like that out loud. Poor guy was probably just listening to us talk because we had American accents. And he looked like a nice guy too. I cringed so hard at the memory. Random Londoner on the subway, if you ever see this comment, I need you to know that many years have passed, but I still feel so bad for what I said. I hope you experienced many good things after my crappy remark that was totally uncalled for. Story 59. About 5 years ago, I, 25-year-old female, was driving up a mountain road with 4 other girls in my car. We hit a gnarly snowstorm, and it was bad enough that other people on the road were getting into accidents, driving into the side of the mountain and driving off the railing. I had a rear-wheel drive car with low-profile sport tires, and I was fishtailing all over the friggin' place. We had to pull over to put the chains on, but because of the special tires I had, the chains were unique cable chains and barely fit the tires. With 5 girls who've never put chains on a car before, you can imagine the struggle. We tried for who knows how long, but it was so cold and so hard to see what we were doing because the winds were raging and snow just kept blowing in. Now, as I remember it, this dude comes walking up to us out of the snowy void in just jeans and a t-shirt and asks if we need help. Of course we said yes, and this poor stranger got down on his hands and knees and even laid on his back in the snow to get under the car to put the chains on. It took him a bit, but he was finally able to get them on. He was soaked and freezing, and to show our gratitude, we thanked him and offered money. He refused it and simply walked away. I'll never forget that incredibly kind stranger, whoever you are. Story 60. In 2009, I went backpacking around Europe. I found myself at Exit Festival in Novi Sad, Serbia. I was totally by myself, and that was fine. I was standing in the crowd watching Arctic monkeys, probably around 40 meters from the stage. I saw at the very front of the crowd, someone threw a full plastic cup up and toward the part of the crowd I was in. The cup flew in a perfect arc and was heading straight for where I was standing. The girl standing next to me and I watched as it flew up and over the crowd and was starting to fall towards us. The throw had been so perfect that nothing had fallen out of the cup for most of its journey. I was perplexed. Why would someone throw a perfectly good beer? Well, the more I thought about it, the more I knew that no one would throw away a perfectly good beer. So that meant one thing. It wasn't beer. As I realized this, the cup fell and dumped its entire contents on the head of the girl standing next to me. I could see that she had realized at about the same time as I did that the cup didn't hold beer. Enough sprayed on me for me to feel its warmth. I was shocked and was staring at her. She turned to me, piss flattening her hair against her face, and we shared a horrified moment. She grimaced, looked like she was about to cry, then pushed her way out of the crowd. I often wonder what happened to that girl. A funny addendum. I got home from the festival and told my then boyfriend the story. He got angry and told me that he had told me that story a while ago, because his boss was from Sheffield and that exact same scenario had happened to him, apparently relayed through my ex. The moral of the story is, don't go see Arctic monkeys unless you want a cup full of piss to land on your head. Story 61. I was a socially anxious teenager alone on the bus to college when a middle-aged man sat parallel to me, asked if he could sit beside me. Being British, this triggered alarms. This is not normal behavior over here. I shrugged and muttered, whatever, yeah, and then he slid over the lane and landed beside me, bringing with him a backpack and a tent. Then he started talking to me. He began asking about me to get things rolling, and apologized after realizing my clear bemusement. He explained that he was going through a rough time and really needed someone to talk to, and asked me if I could lend an ear for a bit. I agreed, doing my best to hide my reluctancy. He told me that he just finished working his night shift and arrived home earlier than usual to find his friend having breakfast with his wife in their kitchen. He showed me his skinless knuckles and his torn shirt as evidence of the wild fist fight he'd just been in. After kicking the crap out of this bloke, he grabbed his tent and some gear and bought a bus ticket to Newcastle to buy some supplies for his escape from the madness, in the form of a solitary camping out trip. He told me everything about his current situation in great detail: his kids, his profession, his favorite music, his evaluation of his marriage, which was both hilarious and sad. He had a fantastically dry sense of humor about it. I quite liked him. I just cracked on with him for an hour and a half until we arrived at the station. When we got there, he reached into his bag and pulled out a Bruce Springsteen CD and handed it to me. We talked about music, and Springsteen was his favorite, but I wasn't particularly familiar with him. "This is for you, son. Thanks for the chat." We wished each other luck, shook hands, and then parted. Turns out, I actually effing love Bruce Springsteen. Story 62. Her name was Angela, and I thought she was my soulmate. I was in debate club for sophomore year of high school and had not had any luck with the girls in my district up until then. I was not really anything special back then and had severe social anxiety because of my immigration status in the US. Further, my mom was really strict with my time outside of school, so I didn't have a large circle of friends. Angela changed all of that during one of the debate regional competitions I attended. Her and I were waiting for our teams to get done in the library of this high school, and we started casual conversation about the debate, where we stood, etc. That progressed to us talking about why we were in debate, and then finally to us talking about our lives outside of debate. This girl was so beautiful, and I was starstruck with how magnetic her personality was. I was feeling hyper aware that our conversation was getting more personal. Her family life mirrored some of mine regarding the strict mom and being the child of immigrants, and I thought I would quit while I was ahead. I went off to look at some books in the library and felt pretty pleased with myself for having that experience. A few minutes later, she comes to the same aisle and starts asking what I'm browsing. She gets really close to me and holds part of the book that I was holding. At this moment, this surreal feeling that I may have an actual connection with this girl, and more importantly, that she feels it too, puts me in this dazed state, and I'm unsure what I should do. The moment doesn't have time to materialize into more because our respective teams come back into the library. We go back to the main part of the library and part ways, with her saying she enjoyed our conversation. I never asked for her number and still wonder what could have happened if I had. At the next competition, a month or so later, I don't see her. I ask around and try to find the roster for her school, but I was not able to find the name Angela in any of the 6 teams from the different schools in our regional competition group. To this day, I still think of this girl who single-handedly made me feel something and gave me hope that there are people out there who can stir emotions and reciprocate affection. For what it's worth, and on the off chance she's a Redditor, hi Angela, you're quite amazing, and I hope you've been doing well all these years. Thank you. Story 63. Well, I never saw them again, but I know they've seen me. We were in Banff, Canada on a bus tour. Drive around in a bus while the driver points out all the cool things to see. So occasionally there was a neat tour on the one day where we didn't go skiing. Sometimes that afternoon I had to go to the bathroom, so I headed for the back of the bus, went in, did my business, and then had the handle pop off the door into my hand. So I'm stuck. I figure my mom, I was 12-ish, would eventually wonder where I was, so I sat on the counter and waited. A half hour later, the bus stopped and there was a knock on the door. Driver asked if everything was okay. I explained the problem. The door wouldn't open from the outside either. By opening the window in the bathroom and the bus window in front of it, we could chat about the problem. Eventually, it was decided that I could either hang out in the bathroom for the next 3 hours until we finished the tour and went back to the bus depot, or I could jump out of the window. I jumped, landed in a snowbank, and twisted my ankle. We had a laugh and headed back to the bus entrance. It's important to note here, my mom and I were very much in the minority as we were just about the only white people on the bus. The rest were tourists from Japan. I can tell you without any exaggeration that there were more high-end areas on that bus than your local camera shop. I can also tell you without exaggeration that every single one of those cameras were aimed at me and shooting once I got back to the bus. Just like the idea of people from all across Japan pulling out their slide projector to relive their trip to the Canadian Rockies with their friends and family and laughing as they point out the fat white kid who had to jump out of the tour bus window. Story 64. 10 or so years ago, I was on an airplane and the lady next to me had a 9-month-old baby. The lady was clearly frazzled and a rude guy across the aisle complaining every time the baby made noise didn't help. The baby tried to climb on me numerous times and the mom apologized and stopped him. I told her it was fine. I have nieces and nephews and really enjoy babies. After the 3rd or 4th time, he cried and tried to climb onto me. I offered to hold him. The mom was obviously relieved. She was trying to hold him and make a bottle at the same time, and replied, "Oh, would you?" I held the baby the rest of the flight, keeping him happy and distracted by showing him pictures of my nieces and nephews on my iPad, and kept a running narration of them to keep his attention. I felt a little bad for the guy in the window seat having to listen to me. He spit up on me at one point, and the mom was so apologetic, offering to pay to dry clean my shirt. But I explained I'd carried my luggage on, so I'd just change when we got to the next airport. And I'd been spit up on so many times in my life, so it wasn't a big deal at all. She told me her name and his names at one point, but I don't remember them now, and we both had to go in different directions to make connections. But we just had a nice time. Young mom, her baby, and a random stranger who didn't mind a baby climbing on her. I hope the rest of their flying went well and they've had a happy life. The baby was a little cutie. Story 65. This actually did happen to a real person, and the real person is me. I had gone to catch a train. This was April 1976 in Cambridge, UK. I was a bit early for the train. I'd gotten the time of the train wrong. I went to get myself a newspaper to do the crossword, and a cup of coffee and a packet of cookies. I went and sat at a table. I want you to picture the scene. It's very important that you get this very clear in your mind. Here's the table, newspaper, cup of coffee, packet of cookies. There's a guy sitting opposite me, perfectly ordinary looking guy wearing a business suit carrying a briefcase. It didn't look like he was going to do anything weird. What he did was this. He suddenly leaned across, picked up the packet of cookies, tore it open, took one out, and ate it. Now, this, I have to say, is the sort of thing the British are very bad at dealing with. There's nothing in our background, upbringing, or education that teaches you how to deal with someone who, in broad daylight, has just stolen your cookies. You know what would happen if this had been a big deal in South Central Los Angeles. There would have very quickly been gunfire, helicopters coming in, CNN, you know. But in the end, I did what any red-blooded Englishman would do. I ignored it. And I stared at the newspaper, took a sip of coffee, tried to do a clue in the newspaper, couldn't do anything, and thought, what am I going to do? In the end, I thought nothing of it. I'll just have to go for it. And I tried very hard not to notice the fact that the packet was already mysteriously opened. I took out a cookie for myself. I thought that settled him. But it hadn't, because a moment or two later, he did it again. He took another cookie. Having not mentioned it the first time, it was somehow even harder to raise the subject the second time around. Excuse me, I couldn't help but notice. It doesn't really work. We went through the whole packet like this. When I say the whole packet, I mean there were only about 8 cookies, but it felt like a lifetime. He took one, I took one. He took one, I took one. Finally, when we got to the end, he stood up and walked away. Well, we exchanged meaningful looks, then he walked away, and I breathed a sigh of relief and sat back. A moment or two later, the train was coming in, so I tossed back the rest of my coffee, stood up, picked up the newspaper, and underneath the newspaper were my cookies. The thing I like particularly about this story is the sensation that somewhere in England there's been wandering around for the past quarter century a perfectly ordinary guy who had the exact same story, only he doesn't have the punchline. Story 66. I've never publicly shared this story outside of my closest circle of friends, but I felt now is the right time, so here goes. A few years ago, I was living alone in a small apartment above a garage in Maine. I had originally moved to Maine to live with my best friend, but due to a sudden pregnancy, I had to move and find my own place. This situation led to me becoming very depressed over the span of a year or so. It was at that point in my life I hit rock bottom and quit my job, deciding it would be better to end it all rather than continue on the way I was going. I picked a small spot next to a river. It was some kind of reserve and it was beautiful. I'd picked that place mostly because it was the off-season, so no one would be there. I sat in my car with a rifle staring out at the river and trying to pull the trigger, when an older man driving a truck pulled up not too far from my car. I immediately panicked and put the rifle down out of view, thinking that if he called the cops, I would end up in a mental hospital. I planned to just wait for him to leave, since most people who would come by tended to take a few pictures and leave, but he didn't do that. Instead, he began to unload wood from his truck for fencing. I couldn't believe my luck. On that day, at that time, this man just had to be here. The man proceeded to start repairing a fence that just happened to be in complete view of my car. After a while, I completely lost my nerve and ended up leaving. That day was a turning point in my life. I now look back and think just how lucky I was to have been saved by his presence, and I don't even know who he was, but I'll never forget him for the rest of my life. Story 67. I was house sitting this awesome house while visiting Australia, and got back there quite late and realized I had locked the keys at my house. I was with my daughter and we decided to go in the backyard because we had some idea there was a spare key. Now, the backyard was like a jungle, and I only had my torch from my phone. I could only remember it was under a rock, and when I went into the backyard, there were rocks everywhere, at least 100 scattered and hidden under trees and shrubs, and I learned pretty quick there were many spider webs with spiders in them. So we're looking with no luck, and the neighbors popped their head over. Probably heard me scream when a spider went in my hair that was the size of my hand. I remember the owner of the house saying their neighbors were cool, so I felt comfortable talking to them, telling them what I was doing at 12 a.m., looking like I was trying to burgle the house. They were this older, quirky couple, and the husband went and got his super torch when he found out what we were doing. We all did a joint search for half an hour with no luck when they asked me, do I like tequila? It happened to be they were having tequila and weed party in their backyard with each other and playing 70s music. Gave up the idea of finding the key. I went over, put my daughter down on the couch to sleep, and had a tequila party with them. They offered me their spare bed if I couldn't find the key later. Had a blast with them. Played some instruments, danced, heard some crazy stories. They were the sweetest couple, and it ended up that the husband used to be in a band with my dad back in the day. Crazy small world. Never saw them again after that. It was a couple years back. Also, the tequila woke my mind up, and by the end of a couple hours drinking, I remembered that the key was by the lemon tree. Story 68. This'll probably get buried, but I've wanted to tell this story for half my life, but there was never a context to tell it, so thanks, OP. So I left Saudi Arabia at 18 to go to the US for college. On the plane, I was seated next to this average-looking older white guy, about 70 years old or so. We exchanged brief pleasantries, buckled in, and the plane took off. Now I'd spent a few years as a kid in the Midwest, coming back to Saudi around first grade. Enough time to master English and gain a solid Midwest accent before we eventually headed back to Saudi and maintained the language through the ubiquitousness of American culture, cartoons, music, movies, etc. So the plane travels out and we begin talking again. The man asked me about my plans, which state and university I'm going to, how I learned my English, all that jazz. I asked him about himself, and he was an engineer who happened to be living and working in the same city and state I'd stayed in as a wee lad. Very pleasant man, with a pleasant demeanor and very pleasant conversation as we talked about my experience as a kid in the US, the culture shock of coming home, what it's like growing up in Saudi. I turn and ask him about himself and his career and family, to which he cheerfully expounds on his life, which he clearly made the most of, then gives me advice about college life and wistfully mentions how lucky I was to be starting fresh on my path through life, something that really resonates with me now that I'm older. Much nodding and chuckling in the conversation up till now. But it takes a turn for the solemn when I ask him about his time in Saudi and why he was there. The man wasn't exactly upbeat, but wasn't morose either, and very casually, very unemotionally, explains that he was in Saudi to pick up the remains of his son, a 20-something young man who had been a contractor working on one of the American military bases as an engineer. I presumed was following in his dad's footsteps. An accident happened about 6 months into his contract, and he'd been burned to death. I, of course, gave him my condolences, and after a while, remarked on how calm he was. Mind you, we Arabs tend to be an emotional lot, yet here this man was, with his only son's remains somewhere in the cargo hold beneath us, probably not 10 feet away, and good God, was he the very measure of composure and dignity. Sometimes life hands you situations you have no control over, and how you compose yourself to these situations defines not just the outcome, but who you are. This was my first real experience with an adult American, and the experience impressed upon me the values of American culture. Very subtle, yet very powerful. Perhaps it seems silly, but I was in awe of that man. He had a lasting impact on not only my perceptions of America and Americans, but how I wanted to be, how I wanted to compose myself and act with utmost dignity when faced with life's challenges and tragedies. It was a lesson and a model that helped me a lot in the decades since. Wherever you are, Mr. Green, I just want to say that although you might have had to bury a boy that you'd helped raise to be a man, that day you also helped usher another boy to manhood. God bless. Story 69. When I had just turned 18, I went on a cruise that stopped in Mexico with my family. As an American, I was stoked that my mom and dad had agreed to let me drink. I had a friend with me, and we met some other Americans around our age. I was a bit shy at the time and didn't do well with girls, would always get nervous. One of the girls that was there with her brother was to this day one of the most beautiful women I've ever met. With a few drinks under my belt, I was talking to her and making small talk, getting us adult beverages on my parents' tab for good measure. We had an amazing time. Fast forward 3 hours and her parents come find her. They say they need help looking for her brother, 16 years old or so. We go back to the last place we saw him. He was unconscious and vomiting due to alcohol poisoning on the beach. Apparently, he had won a volleyball tourney and they had given him a bottle of tequila, to which him and his friend tried to finish. We got the medics and I stood by to try and help her, and her entire family were in a panic. I was terrified. At that time, I had never seen someone so out of it. Then they started calling for all passengers on the cruise to get back on the ship. My parents said it was last call, and we tried to assure the family that the kid would surely be fine. I gave her a hug. I went back to the ship and never saw her again. I hope her brother was okay that day. I tried to look her up on Facebook later when it got popular to find out, but couldn't find her. We had an amazing time, followed by one of the saddest. I hope her and her family are doing well. What a roller coaster of a day in Mexico. Story 70. I was terminally ill, awaiting a double lung transplant. I'd been stuck in hospital for around 6 months and had had enough, so my wife and I decided to take me out for an hour to the nearest park, Hyde Park, London. So I'm taken in a wheelchair to our car. Complete with portable breathing machine and oxygen, we make our escape. Just told the nurses we were going downstairs for a short while. We get to the park and find a bench to sit on overlooking the Serpentine. It's a beautiful day and I'm so content sitting there, looking out across the lake when an elderly Indian lady walks up, stops right in front of me and stares at me. Now, given that I'm effectively wearing a portable respirator, I was used to getting a few weird looks, but the amount of time this lady is staring at me becomes a bit uncomfortable and a little rude. But then she leans forward, places her hand on my shoulder and says, "You're going to be all right," then simply walks away without saying another word. I turn and look at my wife in bemusement, and we give each other a WTF look. I then turn around to look at the lady walking away, but she had literally vanished. The freakiest thing I've had experienced. Turns out she was right. Less than a month later, I had a double lung transplant that saved my life. Fast forward to today, and I'll be celebrating 11 years this September. I often think about her, who she was, what she said, and where she disappeared to. Completely surreal. Story 71. When I was a younger girl, I was on a trip to a chat community weekend from Germany to Vienna with my BFF. It was an 8-hour trip by car. There was another car always nearby with a license plate from my home district. Behind and front, side to side. We even stopped at the same gas station. It was funny because the guy literally stuck on us. On the community meeting in a large bar, I stumbled over exactly that guy and creeped out a bit, asking him why he was stalking me and my BFF. Then I wondered, as he wore a name tag from the event and I recognized his name. I remembered who he was, a pretty silent guy that I chatted with every now and then, but very deep intellectual conversations that I really appreciated. I was stunned, never saw a picture of that guy before, and we sat together for several hours. It turned out that we, unknowingly, lived just 5 minutes apart from each other, but had to travel almost 900 km to finally meet, in a different country. It was great, and I was really happy to have met him in person, and he was pretty cute. I hope this wouldn't be the last time. We exchanged phone numbers to stay in contact after the meeting. Next day, we made our way back home, same way. 2 cars always near each other. He had to drive 10 km further than us. 2 days later, I give him a call, but some lady answered the phone. It was his mother. I found out he had an accident on the day of our return, short from home, and died almost immediately. She asked who I was, and we talked some time. As I was one of the last people talking to her son, I was even invited to the funeral. When the ceremony was over, a young man came over. He was told who I am and wanted to talk to me. My brother sent a message in the night after the community meeting. He said he has never been happier as he met a really nice girl. She might be the one. Story 72. One of the cities I visited during my time in Bolivia and Potosi, which was once the richest city in the world thanks to its abundant silver and other metals. Many of these were found in Cerro Rico, the rich hill next to the city. I arrived into Potosi in Bolivia early in the morning and went straight to the Sustainable Mine Tour company run by former miners. We were told that there would be no mining activity that day due to a festival held on the last Saturday of the month. I signed up for the tour anyway and met the others. Our trip to Cerro Rico involved a stop off at a market where we bought dynamite and some 97% ABP spirit and some beers to gift to the miners for their celebration. We arrived and were given a brief tour of the mine, then brought outside to sit alongside the miners. We were arranged on logs in a circle, and there were 2 llamas center stage. lay down on all fours with their legs tied together with rope. Beers were handed around and then thanks were given by various members of the cooperative, including for the tour participants and for Theo, the protector of the mines. The men then proceeded to wrestle the llamas and cut their necks with apparently blunt knives. One llama lasted a lot longer than the other, but finally both lay twitching in the sand. The next task was to skin the llamas and cut the meat up, which the more able-bodied and stronger-stomached of us get involved with. The men took great pleasure in coating us with llama blood that they collected in bowls during the throat slitting, and we were covered in it very quickly. The most memorable image I have in my head is one of the men severing the bladder of a llama and drinking the urine straight from it. The other men seemed so disgusted. I have some amazing photos of the day. The women were meanwhile stoking the barbecues and over the next few hours cooked up the llamas. As a group of very different people, we ate the llamas and drank the spirit mixed with lemonade. We were all very drunk and the sun was very hot, and I had made friends with lots of people, most of whom I never saw again.